What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and welcome back to another set review here on the channel, and today we are going to be covering Ultra Prism. So one thing that is worth noting before we get too deep in this set review is that in Japan in their SM5 Ultra Sun and Moon set, their set had, I believe it was 6 GXs, but for the Ultra Prism international release of the set, in the product description is listed there will be 10. So there might be some cards we actually may have omitted from this set review. And speaking of which, we actually ran a community poll on the channel recently, basically asking you guys, did you want to see an earlier review of the set that covered just the Japanese cards that might potentially be missing a few English ones, or would you rather have a complete set review later, maybe on the actual release date or even a little bit after, depending on when the full set actually leaks? And the poll was actually pretty evenly split for the most part. So to try to compromise, what I'm going to do here is we're still going to do the early set review. That way I can give you guys my opinion on all of the cards that are coming out, maybe start getting some deck ideas out there for you guys to start thinking about. And if there are any relevant cards that we missed from this set review, I think I'm just going to do a separate video kind of detailing the missing cards from the set. So I feel like since the poll was so closely, evenly split, this might be a nice compromise to please both parties. So with that being said, let's talk about the actual Ultra Prism set itself. So this is going to be our 5th Sun and Moon set, and technically the first of the Ultra Sun and Moon sets in Japan. And so, as usual with any of the, first sets in a new block of cards, there's typically some new mechanics and things introduced, and Ultra Prism is no exception to that. So, a lot of familiar things are returning. We still have GXs, we have new Ultra Beasts, etc. But the big new thing from Ultra Prism is the return of the Lost Zone and the introduction of a new type of card called Prism Stars. These are going to be the new mechanics that are introduced in this set. So the Lost Zone is a mechanic returning from way back in the day. It's kind of like a more permanent discard pile. So that's what these Prism Star cards are going to be based around. And then the other big thing with the set, it's going to be kind of focused around the Sinnoh region. So a lot of Diamond and Pearl era Pokemon. You have Garchomp in there, Leafeon, Glaceon. So a mixture of Gen 4 Pokemon and some of the Sun and Moon or Ultra Sun and Moon Pokemon as well. But I definitely think right off the bat, Ultra Prism gives people much more to be excited about. So let's dive into the actual set review and see what is worth talking about. So the first Pokemon in the set review we are going to be talking about is going to be a new Cherrim. So Cherrim is a Stage 1 Pokemon. It has this attack Seed Bomb for a Grass Energy. Does 30 damage. Seems really good, right? Just kidding. That is not the reason we are talking about this card. We are looking at Cherrim because it has this ability called a Weather Guard. Each of your grass Pokemon has no weakness. So a lot of Pokemon in the past have had these types of abilities. We even had another grass Pokemon called Leafeon all the way back from, I believe it was Nibble Victories, who had a similar ability. It was a stage 2, but that didn't really see much play. So you might be thinking, well, these Pokemon in the past haven't seen much play, so why are we talking about Cherrim now? Well, the big reason is that Cherrim is a stage 1 Pokemon, so that means it takes up a lot less deck space and is easier to get in play than a stage 2. And, grass has a pesky fire weakness. Getting rid of fire weakness is actually a pretty big thing to get rid of, since Volcanion, has been kind of a popular archetype ever since its inception. And with the rise of metal Pokemon in this set and the upcoming Solgaleo promo that I'm sure will be released, I think, in the time of March, if you're playing grass, you're going to need a way to deal with fire Pokemon, since they look to maybe be in a good position going into this next format. So this is actually kind of nice because that means you're deciduized. They're not weak to grass anymore. Your Leafeon GXs, which we'll talk about here shortly, not weak to grass anymore. Your Golisopod GX, not weak to fire anymore. So these are all good Pokemon that are strong in the metagame, but can sometimes struggle against these fire decks. So being able to play just a 1/1 line of a Cherrim can be half decent, especially with the new Leafeon GX, which I will mention here in a minute. We'll get to that. Leafeon actually makes it pretty easy to get a Cherrim into play in these situations that you want it as well. So Cherrim, I'm actually going to kind of say keep an eye out for this card. I don't want to commit entirely to saying this card is good, just because historically these eliminating weakness Pokemon have not been that great in the past. But like I said, since this is a stage 1, I do think this is going to be a little bit easier to get into play, and it's going to be more worth considering than these types of cards have been in the past. So next up on our list is going to be our first GX. It's going to be that Leafeon GX I just previously touched on. So let's take a look at Leafeon. Gets its first GX debut in the card game. Has 200 hit points, pretty standard for all of the Evolution GXs. Has this ability, Nature's Breath. So once during your turn before you attack, this Pokemon is your active Pokemon. You may heal 50 damage from one of your Pokemon with energy attached. Next up we have Solar Beam. Its main attack for Grass and Double Colorless Energy does a solid 110 damage, and then its GX move, Grand Bloom GX, for a single Grass Energy. For each of your basic Pokemon on your bench, search your deck for a card that evolves from that Pokemon and put it onto that Pokemon. Then shuffle your deck. So lots of interesting things going on with Leafeon GX. So I think the first and most obvious one is just going to be the GX attack. This is the main reason we are so excited for this card. So Grand Bloom GX is great. Just a single Grass Energy, you can immediately start setting up a ton of Pokemon on your field. And even on any other Pokemon, I think this would be a great attack. But the fact that we have the Eevee that has that nice Energy Evolution ability makes this card that much better. So Energy Evolution, just to give some context, it's a ability on Eevee. Whenever you attach a basic energy from your hand onto Eevee, you get to search your deck for a Pokemon of the same type that evolves from Eevee and evolve. So this means that you can actually get this Leafeon up and going on the first turn of the game. If you go second, you can actually use this attack on your first turn to immediately start setting up. So ideally, I think kind of your game plan is play Bridget, get some Pokemon on your bench, and then use Grand Bloom GX to evolve each of them. And this GX move is just so strong because there's tons of Pokemon worth evolving in the card game that can sometimes be a little clunky to get in play. So I'll just briefly touch on a few different ideas that I've personally kind of been thinking about. I think the first and major one that most people have been talking about is going to be Decidueye GX. So in the past, we've had Forest of Giant Plants to get out Decidueye. We have Rare Candy at the time of filming. And it's a stage 2, it's sometimes clunky to get in play, but with Leafeon GX, this actually might offer us a new way to get Decidueye in play very quickly. So ideally, if we can open with an Eevee or get an Eevee into the active spot and play Bridget, and we have 3 Rowlet on the bench, well, that means we can get basically 3 Dartrix into play on the first turn of the game, and on turn 2, we can maybe get a couple Decidueyes up and going immediately. So this seems very strong as a new way to get out Decidueye. Also, like I said, we just mentioned Cherrim as well. So if you do Bridget yourself a Cherubi into play, you can immediately evolve into that Cherrim, getting rid of your weakness. Also good if you play maybe some support Pokemon like Octillery or Zoroark GX. Some of the trouble with these Pokemon that you run low counts of is just getting them out of the deck. You can easily bridge it for them, but drawing into them when you need them sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge if you don't have something like an Ultra Ball. So I think Leafeon also helps enable you to run these thin counts of certain Pokemon that can otherwise be a little bit inconsistent to get out and play. So that's just, like I said, the main idea. Decidueye is the one I think most people are initially going to gravitate testing out, but then I still do think there are some other ones that we can briefly mention in this set review. So I think another potential option is Beedrill from Evolutions. Beedrill's kind of been not the greatest card. We've covered it a bit on the channel here and there, but it does more damage for every Beedrill you have in play. And getting out 4 stage 2s to do a lot of damage is kind of difficult. But with something like Leafeon, that actually might make it more consistent for you to get out Beedrills to use its attack. So that is a consideration. However, I think Decidueye, if we are going to be trying to search out stage 2 Pokemon, Decidueye just seems like a stronger one. But then also too, with this Leafeon, I think another consideration is the promo Lurantis. So maybe if you wanted to base your entire deck around Leafeon as your main attacker, so if you get out the promo Lurantis, you'll actually do more damage with your grass Pokemon. So let's say you bridge it out 3 Lurantis first turn and evolve them all into these promo Lurantises. You're going to boost the damage output of your Leafeons by 20 for each Lurantis that you get in play. So if you got 3 Lurantis, your Solar Beam attack is doing 170, 200 with a Choice Band. So you can kind of go all in with just as Leafeon as a main attacker and kind of forego any other support Pokemon like Decidueye as an example. So Leafeon, I just think, opens up so much creativity. And another thing that's great is that Grand Bloom actually is not limited to only grass Pokemon. So you can get out all sorts of other Pokemon. We have that new Unit Energies that came out in the set, which we'll talk about later. So if there's maybe some other types that you want to run, or if you play Rainbow Energy, you can potentially run those in your Leafeon deck and try to get them out a little bit more consistently. Only downside to that, if you start playing other types of Pokemon that require other forms of energy, it might make actually getting a grass energy on an Eevee on the first turn a little bit more inconsistent. But like I said, the flexibility is definitely there, especially if you have Pokemon of different types that only attack for colorless energy. So that's the main reason I am so excited for Leafeon. This card just seems so fun, but it still has, like I said, an ability and another attack as well. I briefly mentioned Solar Beam, just a solid 110 damage. You're going to two-shot most of the things in the format for just a grass and DCE. So its attack cost, pretty manageable. Damage output, pretty average. With a Choice Band, you hit for 140, which is great because you do two-shot everything. But then you can also tank some hits because of Nature's Breath. So like I said, if Leafeon is your active Pokemon, you can heal 50 from one of your Pokemon with energy. So this will enable your Leafeons to tank a little bit. If you play a Guzma potentially on your turn, if you have a Leafeon active, you can heal 50 and then promote a different Pokemon with Guzma to heal an additional 50. So lots of tanking potential with this card as well. So, the attack is okay. Solar Beam, like I said, is just kind of a vanilla 110 damage, nothing too special. But the GX move is absolutely crazy. One of my favorite GX moves to be printed so far, and the ability will add some, extra staying power to your Leafeon. And one thing I think is actually nice about the Decidueye route, for example, if you wanted to run Decidueye, it kind of frees you up to run other tools instead of Choice Band. So right now, you need Choice Band to two-shot Stage 2 GXs. But if you're playing Decidueye to increase your damage output, I think that can even free you up to play other tools like maybe Muscle Dumbbells or Assault Vest and other ways to tank with Leafeon. Just all sorts of different combinations of cards I think we could potentially put with Leafeon. So excited to start testing this card out. Definitely stay tuned to the channel. We are definitely going to cover this card and post some deck profiles with this thing. So I'm definitely just going to say right off the bat, Leafeon is great. Definitely a card I expect to see people to try out, and one that I'm really looking forward to myself. The next card we're going to talk about is going to be Mow Rotom. So we have a bunch of Rotoms in this set we're going to talk about, and they all kind of have a similar type of mechanic. So this is going to be the Mow Rotom. It's the grass one, 90 hit points, nothing too special there. But what's interesting about all these Rotom cards is that they have this ability, Rotomotor. If there are 9 or more Pokemon tool cards in your discard pile, ignore the attack costs of this Pokemon. So that's kind of the main reason we're even going to discuss these cards. Outside of this ability, I don't think these cards are really even worth talking about, just to be honest. So that's why we're talking about all these cards. So Mow Rotom has Special Cut for a grass energy and 2 colorless, but like I said, we're going to be trying to attack for 0 damage ideally. Or for 0 energy, I'm sorry. 0 damage would not make a very good deck. So it has Special Cut for 60 damage and discard a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So we're kind of, like I said, keeping in mind that all of these attacks are going to cost 0 energy ideally. So for 0 energy to do 60 and discard a special energy, that's pretty solid since a lot of cards in the current format at the time of filming are super special energy reliant. You have things like Gardevoir GX, Galispod GX, Savali GX, all sorts of things play double colorless energy at the time of filming. Then there are some new special energies that come out in this set as well, so we'll have to see if those end up making a splash in the metagame as well. But, definitely a half-decent attack for 0 energy. Kind of what I'm thinking for all these Rotom cards, since there's fire, water, lightning, colorless, all sorts of different types. I feel like they're trying to push some sort of Rotom box deck. So we'll have to talk about all of the other Rotoms as well throughout this set review. But it's one of those cards I'm really just going to say keep an eye out on, because you are incredibly ability reliant. If your opponent plays something like a Garbodor or an Alolan Muck, which would probably be even worse for you, you're going to have a hard time really making this deck function. So I definitely think these Rotom cards are going to need some other sort of partner. So a couple ideas come to mind. The first one is going to be Gourgeist. So Gourgeist, its entire attack is based on doing damage by discarding your tool card. So there's some natural synergy there between Gourgeist and these Rotoms. But having said that, Gourgeist seems to be a decent attacker on its own. If you're finding space for other cards in your deck, if you're playing Gourgeist, you usually would want them to be more tool cards or other ways to draw into tool cards. So that's why I'm not sure if these Rotoms really have a place in the Gourgeist deck. But on the flip side, I do think you could potentially run a thin count of Gourgeist in this Rotom-based deck. I think that would make more sense than trying to cram these into the existing Gourgeist type of archetype. So I think that's an option. I think even though you can attack for 0 energy, I think you should still play some sort of double colorless energy-based attacker just to be able to attack in a pinch if you have to. So the big one that's going to come to mind for me is going to be Zoroark GX. I think that is going to be the main attacker I would consider in this type of deck. So the reason for that is it's an easy attacker to power up just for a double colorless energy. So that's good all on its own, but its tradability not only will allow you to draw extra cards, but it will allow you to discard tool cards as well. So I think Zoroark has some natural synergy with this deck. So if I was going to build a deck around these Rotoms, that's kind of initially what I would gravitate towards. So I feel like what you do is you place a couple copies of Zoroark, and then maybe a couple different counts of these different Rotoms depending on what the metagame is. You play Grass, obviously, to deal with Grass weak attackers, Fire to deal with Metal Pokemon, etc., etc. So I think that's kind of the deck idea that Pokemon's trying to push, but I'm not entirely convinced just yet. These Rotoms, as we'll talk about throughout the set review, they don't hit the hardest, so we'll have to see how good they actually are, but I think this mechanic is definitely interesting. Attacking for 0 energy, as we've seen in the past, is great. Yeah, Mega Prime was one of the best attackers in the format when it came out because it attacked for 0 energy. So I don't think we should underestimate how good attacking for 0 energy actually is. So because of that, I'm going to say keep an eye out for Grass Rotom. Alright, next we are going to be talking about the fire Pokemon from the set, and the first one we are going to be looking at is going to be Magmortar. So Magmortar is a new Stage 1 Pokemon, has 130 hit points, which is honestly pretty solid for a Stage 1. There are some Stage 2s in the game that even have 130 hit points, so definitely a little bit of a tanky Stage 1, which is definitely good. Has 3 retreat costs, which is kind of annoying, but luckily that does make it heavy ball searchable if you wanted to go that route. So let's look at Magmortar. Has this ability, Scorching Body. If this Pokemon is your active Pokemon and is damaged by an attack, the attacking Pokemon is now burned. So definitely an interesting little ability. Burn has definitely gotten a bit of a buff since the XY era, since now Pokemon immediately take 20 damage and your opponent flips to see if they are unburned. So now that Burn has gotten a buff with the Sun and Moon block, you know, this ability is a little bit better than it may have been maybe a year or two ago. So let's also look at its attack, Fire Gun. For 2 fire and a colorless does 80 damage. You may discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. If you do, this attack does 80 more damage. So I gotta say there's some interesting things going on with this Magmortar. So there is a new Infernape in the set, which we will touch on shortly, that will increase burn damage. So that is an option. You can also play potentially Bursting Balloon with Magmortar. So to basically make it to where if your opponent ever attacks into you, they take 8 damage counters. And then Fire Gun, you know, 160 is decent. 190 with a choice band, pretty good. That knocks out basic GXs and EXs in the game. So there's some interesting things going on here, but I think overall this card is just a worse version of Turtonator GX. So what I mean by that is Turtonator has Shell Trap, does 20 damage for 2 colorless energy. If your opponent attacks into you, they take 8 damage counters. Well, that's kind of similar to this ability, Scorching Body. Like I said, if you play Burst Balloon or something like that to increase the, or even Infernape, like I mentioned, increase the damage from Scorching Body, it's kind of like Shell Trap. Granted, it is an ability, but Turtonator also has a lot more hit points and does base damage before the factoring in the effects of the attack. Its damage output could be buffed by Volcanion EX. So that's the first strike against Magmortar. And the other reason why this is, I think, just kind of a worse Turtonator is because of Fire Gun. It's the same attack cost as Turtonator's main attack to do 160, and Turtonator also discards energy. But the thing is, Turtonator has much higher amount of HP. You can max Elixir to it. You have Volcanion EX to, you know, boost its attack output. You have Nitro Tank GX to get a ton of fire energy on the field. So Unfortunately, I think Magmortar is just completely outclassed by Turtonator. I don't really see any reason to play this over Turtonator GX or other fire Pokemon in general. The attack cost is, I think, just a really weird and awkward. You know, in the expanded format, you have things like Blacksmith to be able to easily power this thing up, so that is worth mentioning. This card is easier to power up and expanded, but even still, expanded, I don't think would treat this card that much better. Expands a much faster and more aggressive format than standard is. So even though you do gain Blacksmith, I don't think it's even much better in that format. But in standard, especially, this card is just not that good. It's just overall just outclassed by Turtonator. Like I said, it has some interesting things going on, and maybe if there becomes an efficient way to power this thing up, it might be worth consideration at some point, because doing 190 with, again, factoring in choice band and as a one prize attacker, you know, is good, you know, kind of in a vacuum, not factoring in any other factors. But like I said, there's just too much going against this card, I think, for it to be good right now. So for that reason, I'm going to say you might want to avoid Magmortar. Definitely a nice looking card, will look good in your binder, but that is about it for the moment, unfortunately. So since this is a set based around the Sinnoh region and Gen 4, it only makes sense that the starter evolutions get represented in the set at some point. And of course we have the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Infernape, like we just mentioned. So Infernape, 130 hit points on a stage 2, kind of weak. We just looked at Magmortar, who has 130 hit points as a stage 1. But luckily Infernape isn't going to be doing much attacking if you do play with this card, so most likely it's just going to sit on your bench anyways. So that is the one good side to it having kind of low HP, is that it's not going to be up front anyways. So the reason we are taking a look at Infernape is for its ability, Hot-Blooded Fighter. Your opponent's active Pokemon takes 6 damage counters from burn between turns. So yeah, burn just got a pretty huge buff with Infernape. So that means, you know, they automatically take 6 damage counters, and your opponent has to flip to see if they are unburned. But granted, they can still just evolve out of the status condition or retreat, so that is definitely worth noting and makes this ability a little bit less exciting. And then it does have an attack as well. Burst Punch for a fire and colorless is 50 damage, and your opponent's active is now burned, so you can kind of see what they're doing here. But I have to say, I'm really conflicted about this card. I actually love Infernape. I think Infernape is one of the best fire starters out of any game. Like, I just think it's a super cool Pokemon and doesn't get enough love in the community. So I was hyped to see all of the Sinnoh starters in this set for that reason. But I gotta say, I'm a little bit let down. And so, a couple of reasons. Infernape is a stage 2 Pokemon. You're essentially getting a stage 2 in play to do 60 more damage from burn. So that means you also need an effective way to burn your opponent's active Pokemon. So ideally, you want something with a low attack cost that can easily inflict the status condition. That way you can start, you know, doing lots of big burn damage. But again, you're getting out a stage 2 to do 60 more damage. And I just don't like that. It just doesn't seem that good to me. Especially when you look at another stage 2 like Garchomp GX, which can stack additional energy on itself and is a great attacker on its own. I'm just having trouble seeing it. So maybe if Burst Punch was a little bit different, I would be more excited about this card. So Burst Punch, you know, I think either it needs to be 1 energy less to do 50 damage, or it needs to do a higher amount of damage to be worth committing 2 energies. So 2 energy really isn't a lot, to be fair, but it's just very awkward, because if your only Infernape gets knocked out, if you're attacking with this thing, well, guess what? You need 2 more energy in play next turn to be able to power up a fresh attacker, and there's not really an effective way to do that. Now, granted, we do have counter energy that we got from Crimson Invasion, so if you do plan on attacking with Infernape and some sort of deck based around it, you do have counter energy to work with, but, you know, it's still awkward, and that's what I don't like about it. So if you do attack with this thing, they're going to take 6 damage counters, so you're doing basically 110 for 2, which it's not the worst, but more than likely you are going to be knocked out, since you have kind of a low amount of HP for a stage 2, or your opponent can just retreat out of it. So that's just my beef with Infernape. It's just such an awkward Pokemon, but there is, I do think, some hope to this card. There is a Turtonator in the set that will do extra damage or not extra damage, but it will automatically inflict a burn on your opponent for a single fire energy. We're not going to cover that card too much just because outside of the use of Infernape, I don't think it's that great, but you could play something like that to just basically auto burn your opponent for just a single fire energy. You also have access to things like Volcanion EX to maybe steam up and increase that base damage. So I think that is an option, and if I'm going to play Infernape, that is probably the way I would play it for the moment with this Turtonator and Volcanion EX and stuff like that. But, I think just Infernape is just so close to being good, but it's just not quite. So another thing that could have made it better is this: if this ability was your opponent takes 6 more damage counters. That actually would have been pretty big because, that would have meant that they take 8 damage counters from burn. And there's also a Volcarona in the expanded format that increases burn to, I believe, 4 damage counters in between turns. So I'm not sure how that interaction would have gone, but if you could have had like 10 damage counters between turns from burn, that would have been pretty crazy. So, like I said, the ability just a little bit shy of being great. It's just too awkward to get into play, and the attack is just not quite strong enough to make Infernape worth attacking with. So unfortunately, I gotta say Infernape is not good. I definitely think the ability is worth talking about, but I just think this card is just not quite good enough to actually make an impact on the competitive scene. So next up we have the Fire Rotom, and the set's going to be Heat Rotom, 90 hit points just like the last one we mentioned, and it has that same great ability where if you have 9 or more tool cards in your discard pile, ignore the attack cost of this Pokemon. So it just has Heat Blast, 80 damage, nothing too special there. But again, if you're, like we mentioned earlier, if you are building this kind of like a Rotom box deck, it's kind of aiming to be an anti-metagame deck. So with a choice band, you're hitting for 110 on fire weak Pokemon, which means you're doing 220, which is actually a very relevant number against certain Pokemon in the format. So take Golisopod just as an example, has 210 hit points, Heat Rotom can immediately knock it out with a choice band. Same thing for the Leafeon GX that we mentioned earlier in the video. So if we are playing this anti-metagame or Rotom box deck, Heat Rotom actually I do think would be a good attacker in these in these situations, assuming there are good fire weak Pokemon in the format. So I think this Heat Rotom is basically only as good as the Pokemon that are in the format for it to hit for weakness, really. And so, outside of that, there's not too much to talk about. It still has the same ups and downs as the grass one. You still have to get 9 Pokemon tool cards in the discard pile, so you are susceptible to things like Garbodor and Alolan Mug to shut off this ability. But you know what? I'm still going to say keep an eye out on this. I think all of these Rotom cards are interesting enough to build a deck around and at least try out. But, it doesn't hit for a crazy amount of damage. And like I said, this one is only as good as the Fire Weak Pokemon that we have in the actual metagame. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it, but I'm not super enthused yet, but I'm going to be optimistic about this card. So the last of the Fire Pokemon we're going to talk about is going to be Salazzle. So Salazzle is a new Fire type, Stage 1. It has this attack, Burning Poison. For a single fire energy, your opponent's active Pokemon is now burned, poisoned, and confused. And its second attack, Assassinale, for a fire and colorless, does 60 damage. And if your opponent's active Pokemon is affected by a special condition, this attack does 60 more damage. So there's definitely some built-in synergy here between both of these different attacks. The first attack in particular is pretty interesting. You're essentially doing 30 for 1 energy, which not the worst, but on a stage 1 is kind of underwhelming. And then they are confused. Confusion is actually a pretty good status condition. So if your opponent doesn't retreat, they're going to be guaranteed to take at least 40 damage coming back into your turn, potentially 60 if they don't flip out of the burn as well. So that's interesting, and like I said, the second attack definitely has some synergy here. So if in the situation your opponent doesn't retreat or evolve out of this, and let's just say they take the full 60 damage coming back into your turn, if you use Assassinale on the next turn, you're doing 120, which means that you're doing 180, and then they're basically going to be guaranteed to take 190 at the least if they don't flip out of burn, or if they do flip out of burn. But if they don't flip out of the burn, they are going to be taking 210, which is actually pretty impressive. So That's a lot to ask for, though, unfortunately. So, on the flip side, if they do flip out of the burn condition, essentially remove 40 damage there, and they're only going to be taking 170. But even still, that's kind of half decent. Um, Unfortunately, it is 110 hit points, which means this thing gets knocked out kind of easily. But just the biggest downside to this thing is that it's just such an easy effect to play around. So your opponent, like I said, they can just retreat, they can just evolve, or they can play Guzma or Acerola or something like that to get out of the status condition. So I think Salazzle's first attack is just a little bit too easy to play around. The second attack isn't that bad, to be honest, though. 120 for 2 energy on a stage 1. It's not too hard to power up. It does kind of have the same problem Infernape does, where it's kind of awkward to power up. You can play things like counter energy if you want to power one of these up in one turn. One thing that is worth mentioning, you can actually play this with the other Salazzle as well. The one from, I believe it's Guardians Rising, has that hot poison ability. Whenever you evolve into that Salazzle, your opponent's active is burned and poisoned. So if you evolve into that and do Assassinate, effectively they take 150 damage, 180 if you factor in Choice Band as well. We did forget to mention that when calculating the math between Burning Poison and Assassinate previously. So I think that is worth mentioning. It's not mind-blowing, but it's okay. I guess you'd say. And there's actually kind of an interesting combination you could go for in the expanded format where we have access to things like Dimension Valley. You could potentially play something like Mew EX to copy the attacks of Salazzle and use Dimension Valley to only use Assassinate for a single fire energy. So I think that's actually kind of a neat potential way you could build this card. And in the expanded format, there's things like Hypnotoxic Laser to automatically inflict status conditions very easily. So I think actually in the expanded format, this card seems a little bit better. And standard, if I have to be completely honest, it's probably just not hard hitting enough and too easy to play around to actually have a significant impact on the game. But because of its potential use in the expanded format, I'm going to say keep an eye out on this card. I think the fact that you can't abuse Dimension Valley makes this a much more interesting card to potentially look at. So I don't love it. I don't hate it, but like I said, I think keep an eye out on it. It's an interesting card, and it might pop up in some capacity at some point. So next up on our list, we have a new Alolan Sandslash. So it's a 120 hit point stage 1, so that's a pretty decent amount of hit points for a stage 1, especially when you look at the Infernape we recently talked about, only has 130, so definitely a nice little bit of HP there. Metal Weakness pretty standard, 1 retreat cost, which is actually kind of half decent. And the reason we're looking at it is for its first attack, Spike Armor. For 0 energy, it does 30 damage. And if this Pokemon is damaged by an attack during your opponent's next turn, place 6 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So every time you attack with this, you essentially have a built-in bursting balloon. So basically, you'll do 30 for 0 energy. Then if your opponent attacks your Sandslash, they take 6. So essentially, they will take 90 damage if the same Pokemon attacks you, which is, 90 for 0 energy, not too bad, but I mean, you can do some other things, like you can play Choice Band to do 60 base damage for 0 energy, which again, not too bad for 0 energy. Or if you really want to get like kind of gimmicky, you could play a bursting balloon on Sandslash as well, so they take an insane 120 damage anytime they attack into you. So that would actually be kind of degenerate, but unfortunately, though, I don't see this attack being that great, unfortunately. Taking 6 damage counters and doing 30 for 0, it's not that bad, but it's just not good enough. If this attack had been 60 for 0 energy, I would actually be a little bit more enthusiastic just because it hits for better numbers. So, you're only doing 30 at a time, so if your opponent plays Guzma or does something like that, or just passes even, guess what? They're only taking 30 damage, and it's really not enough pressure to put on to really win a game, unfortunately. Like I said, if this was 60 for 0, that'd be much, much better, of course, since then you could 3-shot basic GXs like Tapu Lele and stuff like that. So I think that would be a little bit better. If it did 60 base damage and you play Bursting Balloon, you would knock out basically basic EXs and GXs in one hit if they have 180 hit points or less. So I think this attack is honestly a little bit too It's just a little too underwhelming. It does have another attack for a water and DCE does 90, so 90 for essentially 2 energy attachments isn't, it's not horrible, but we have another Pokemon that we're going to be talking about that has the same attack cost and damage that is much, much better. That is also a stage 1, so I don't think Sandslash can really be looked at for its second attack. Granted, I will say you can also pair it with the Alolan Sandslash from Sun and Moon, or actually I believe it was Guardians Rising that it came out in. That lets you draw a card as an ability, so I think that's fine. You have a little bit of an extra consistency boost, but I really just don't see what deck this would really fit in, and I don't see this being a deck on its own either. Granted, you could get really trolly and you could play some sort of a Alolan Sandslash Pyukumuku deck, so any Pokemon that you put in play, they would have to take 6 damage counters from. Maybe that's a fun deck we could do on PTCGO at some point, but I just don't see this card being that good, though, unfortunately. Like I said, I think its damage output is just a little bit too low, and if you're trying to do decent amounts of damage for 0 energy, I think the Alolan Eradicate from Burning Shadows, I believe it is just a stronger card to do that. So it's just too reactionary for how low its base damage output actually is. So unfortunately, guys, I don't think Sandslash is going to see much play. Okay guys, so Sandslash might not have been that good, but the next Pokemon we're going to look at I'm a lot more enthusiastic about, and that is going to be a new Empoleon. So Empoleon is a 160 hit point stage 2, which is weak to Lightning, which I want to point out is actually a very, very big deal, because at the time of filming, Lightning just is not that popular. You might run into a random Tapu Koko promo in certain decks, but other than that, there's really not like a big, strong Lightning type attacker in the game currently. So Lightning weakness is great because that means things like Glaceon GX won't be able to knock you out in one hit. Same thing for Tapu Bulu, that forces them to discard their energy if they want to take a one prize knockout on you. So the weakness to Lightning is very, very huge here, and I think is one reason Empoleon actually could potentially see play. Also has a 2 retreat cost, which is kind of annoying, but it's about what you would expect for Empoleon, given the other Empoleons we've had over the years. But let's take a look at this guy. So it has this attack total command for a water and colorless. It does 20 damage times the amount of Pokemon on each player's bench. So this is kind of actually like the old school Empoleon back from Dark Explorers, which, did see play here and there, had a very similar attack, but Empoleon from back in the day did have a great ability, which this one doesn't have, but I think this attack is strong enough to where it still warrants being talked about. So right now, luckily in the format we have, players are very reliant on large benches. Every deck typically goes for a Tapu Lele to grab that Bridget to fill up their bench on the first turn. Granted, this could change after the release of another card in this set, which we'll talk about, but right now at the time of filming, that's the current state of the game, and so Empoleon definitely is set up to do well in that type of format. So if both players both have a full bench, you're doing 200 damage or 230 if you have a choice band. And that is actually a huge thing to hit for, because right now 230 is the max amount of HP anything relevant in the format has. There are things, of course, like Metagross and things like that see very fringe play that have more than 230 hit points. But overall, like I said, 230 is the max that you need to hit for. And Gardevoir, which does have 230 hit points, typically does max out their bench. So this attack is very, very good against, like I said, what the current state of the game is. So, but you might be thinking, well, water and colorless, this is kind of awkward to power up. We've seen a lot of these stage 2s and other just generally, half decent Pokemon before like this that have kind of these awkward 2 energy attack costs that don't have a reliable way to get powered up. So why are we talking about this? And that is because, yes, we have things like counter energy, but more importantly, we have Aqua Patch that we got back from Guardians Rising. So of course we can accelerate our water energy out of the discard pile to set up Empoleons. If we did not have Aqua Patch, I would not be nearly as enthusiastic about this card. I think the rating we give this card actually would be on the complete other end of the spectrum if we did not have Aqua Patch. Because the big thing is, if you only have one Empoleon in play set up, and your opponent knocks it out, well guess what? It's going to take you 2 turns without Aqua Patch to power this guy up. But since we do have Aqua Patch, we can actually get another Empoleon up and running in a single turn, which is very important in terms of the viability of this card as a competitive deck. So Empoleon just super, super good. And even if you're not, one-shotting Pokemon and your opponent's, playing around the effect of this attack, well, guess what? You're still a one-prize attacker that can 2-shot your opponent's Pokemon. So even if you have to 2-shot them, you're essentially trading 2 prizes for 1, assuming you're playing against some sort of GX deck. And then it is worth noting, over in the expanded format, we do have access to things like Skyfield. So if both players in that situation have their bench full, you're hitting for 320 before choice ban. So pretty insane card in that respect. You know, in expanded, again, your opponent can play around it, and a lot of decks in expanded might not need to fill their bench to that size. So who knows, maybe in expanded it's not quite as good. Maybe Zoroark GX is just the better Skyfield attacker in expanded, but it's definitely worth mentioning at the least. Now, a couple drawbacks to Empoleon, of course, is that it is stage 2, so it does take a little bit to get into play, and your opponent can play around the effect of this attack. So definitely a downside for the card, but this attack is still, I think, strong enough to where it's worth testing this card out, and it's definitely a card that you should definitely expect to see us give some coverage here on the channel in the near future as well. Empoleon does have another attack though. It has Whirlpool for 2 water and a colorless does 90 damage, and discard 1 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. And I'm not nearly as enthusiastic about this attack. The first problem I have with it is that it takes an extra energy, which means that you have to commit additional energy to use an attack that isn't Empoleon's primary attack. So sometimes that energy could be better served on a different Pokemon. I would have kind of liked to have seen the same energy cost on the second attack, and I think that would have been really made for an interesting card design, because basically it gives you access to an attack that can one-shot your opponent or an attack that can two-shot them. So I would have really liked to have seen the second attack maybe just be like 2 water for 90 and discard an energy. Even just that doesn't seem that broken. So I think that would have been a much better design route to design this card. But nevertheless, it is an okay attack, I guess. If you have choice band, you're hitting for 120, and discarding an energy. The discarding an energy actually can be kind of relevant in certain situations. So, it's worth pointing out this attack. You can use it in a pinch if you have to. But the real reason we are looking at this Empoleon is, of course, for that first attack. So, I'm enthusiastic about this card. I wish it had some sort of built-in consistency like the old Empoleon, but we still do have access to things like Octillery. We also have Zoroark GX. We have Alolan Vulpix. We also have access to things like Brooklet Hill, so there are other ways to get this card up and running. So the real question, though, is potential partners for Empoleon. So, because you need Pokemon on your bench in order to get the most out of this attack. So what do we play with it? Well, I just mentioned a couple. I think Vulpix would be definitely an inclusion here to search out your evolution pieces. Octillery also seems like a good potential partner. Zoroark GX also could be as well, but I kind of like the idea of Octillery a little bit more just because you are a 1 prize attacker, and that means you can kind of force your opponent to only get basically 1 prize at a time outside of maybe like a Tapu Lele GX here and there. So I'm thinking maybe Octillery and Alolan Vulpix, and maybe just some Tapu Lele. Another interesting route that you could potentially go is actually with Lycanroc GX, I believe. So you need Pokemon on your bench in order to do damage, like I said, and Lycanroc likely has an insane coming into play ability, that Bloodthirsty Eyes ability that lets you switch your opponent's active Pokemon with one of their bench. So this could be a nice potential target to put on your bench to fuel this attack. And so maybe in that type of situation, you can cut out maybe some Bridgets, and hey, maybe even cut out some Leles, and maybe you just go like super aggro, like Brooklet Hill, like 4 Brooklet Hill with Octillery, Lycanroc, and Empoleon, and maybe like an Alolan Vulpix, something like that. So I'm just kind of talking out loud here, but these are just some ideas that are coming to mind, just literally as I'm talking about this in the set review right now. So I think there is definitely some flexibility for their card, or for this card, since it only needs Pokemon on the bench. It doesn't need a specific kind, so I think that will open up some area of opportunity to maybe play some interesting coming into play abilities, like Lycanroc, like I just mentioned. So overall, though, Empoleon, I'm very enthusiastic about this card. I really like it. It remains to be seen how strong this attack actually is, since your opponent can potentially play around the effect of it. But nevertheless, I think it's strong enough to worth mentioning about, and definitely a card, like I said, we will be covering here on the channel. So next up, we have a new potential form of energy acceleration. That is going to be Abomasnow. So Abomasnow is 130 hit point, stage 1. Great amount of HP for a stage 1. Has 3 retreat witches. Slightly unfortunate, but that does make it heavy ball searchable, and there are things like Manaphy EX still in the format to be able to give it free retreat if need be. And the reason we're looking at this card is for its ability, Blessing of the Forest or Blessing of the Frost-Covered Trees. So definitely a pretty epic sounding ability name there. And whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may attach a water energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. So this is kind of an alternate way to accelerate water energy. And the only reason I am talking about this is because it's not exclusively to basic Pokemon, and it's not exclusively to water Pokemon. So what I mean by that is in the case of something like Max Elixir, if you wanted to play that to accelerate water energy, it's limited to only basic Pokemon. And in the case of Aqua Patch, it's only limited to water Pokemon. Abomasnow lets you attach water energy to any of your Pokemon. So this can be handy in maybe in certain decks that might not be water type, but could still abuse water energy. There is a new Palkia GX in the set that kind of falls into that category that we might talk about later. So situations like that, Abomasnow, I think could be a consideration, but it's a hard sell. It's a very hard could be. The reason I say that though is because I think overall this card is just inferior to Aqua Patch. And I think it's inferior to Max Elixir as well. And the reason I say that is because just to accelerate a single water energy, you have to commit 2 spots in your deck to a stage 1. And so that is just super clunky, I think. Maybe you could make the case you could play this with that Empoleon that we just mentioned, but since it does take up bench space. But nevertheless, this card is just super, I think, inconsistent and clunky to work with. So you have to, like I said, devote 2 spots to accelerating 1 water energy. Well, you could do that with Max Elixir or 1 Aqua Patch as well. I think even if the Pokemon isn't water type and you want to accelerate water energy, I would still do so with Max Elixir probably before I do so with Abomasnow. Maybe there's some weird situations where this could be preferable, but I just think it's far too inconsistent and clunky to actually have this as a legitimate form of water energy acceleration. Now, let me backtrack a little to that. Empoleon, like I just mentioned, you already do have Aqua Patch, but maybe this Abomasnow could be a potential consideration. Maybe in a deck where, for example, you really can't attach just a single energy every turn and be content with that. So in the case of Empoleon, like I just mentioned, has kind of an awkward 2 retreat cost. Or attack cost. It's manageable, but it's still not probably fast enough at certain points in the game to really win. So Abomasnow could kind of help in those situations and just give you that little extra boost of energy on a certain turn that can just keep you in the game. Because like I mentioned before with Empoleon, if your only powered up Empoleon gets knocked out and you don't have another one ready to go, the deck kind of crumbles apart. So Abomasnow can kind of help you, keep up with the tempo of the match potentially. But I would still argue Aqua Patch is just generally better. But like I said, in the case of Empoleon and the new Palkia GX, I think it's at least a consideration since since this ability is relevant to those cards. But overall, though, I think this card is just probably a little bit too inferior to other forms of energy acceleration that we already have in the format. Alright guys, next up we have one of the most anticipated cards from this set, and that is going to be Glaceon GX. I think everyone just in general is always excited when we get new evolutions, but this one in particular is going to, I think, have a pretty big impact on the game. Alright, that's at least what I'm thinking initially. That's my first impression. So let's take a look at this card and see why it's getting some attention. So it's, of course, like the other GXs, or Evolution GXs, 200 hit points, 2 retreat cost, weak to metal. These are all kind of expected things. But the reason this card is so hyped right now is for its ability, Freezing Stare. As long as this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, each of your opponent's EX and GX in play, hand-to-hand, and in discard pile has no abilities other than Freezing Stare. And this is absolutely huge when just think about how a normal game goes. Like, just think to basically how every deck in the current format works. Oh, turn 1, they play Ultra Ball to get Tapu Lele. That way they can grab a Bridget and start setting up their field. Maybe on turn 2 or 3, they get Zoroark GX in play to help draw some cards. In the case of the recent Memphis Regionals, people have been playing Lycanroc GX to, switch their opponent's active Pokemon around. So just think of how many GX and EX abilities are in the current format, and think of how this card would affect them if you get this into play first turn. And what I mean by that is you don't even have to play Wally. You have to remember we have the Eevee from Sun and Moon that has the Energy Evolution ability. Whenever you attach an energy from hand to Eevee, you get to search your deck for a Pokemon of the same type and immediately evolve into it. Basic energy, I should clarify that. But so yeah, on the first turn, you can actually just attach a water energy and evolve immediately into Glaceon GX. And turn one, have this crazy ability lock, basically preventing your opponent from playing their Tapu Leles to their fullest potential. And that is just so huge. Like I said, for how the current format is, it's very reliant on things like Tapu Lele and Zoroark GX, especially on the first turn of the game. That's the big thing because people can't search out their, their bridges to set up. Even so, there's other decks where they might have a dead hand and they have to Ultra Ball to grab a Lele to grab a supporter, but I think Glaceon kind of just spits in their face and says, no, you can't do that. So this ability is absolutely insane. This is one of the best abilities that's printed in the current format, I would say. So just think of all of the other abilities that we have. We have Tapu Lele, we have Zoroark, we have Lycanroc, we have Gardevoir, we have things like Volcanion EX. So just a lot of great abilities that are worth shutting off with this card. But the ability on its own is fantastic, but let's look at the rest of the card because it still needs some half-decent attacks to win a game more than likely. So first attack, Frozen Bullet for a water and 2 colorless energy. It does 90 damage and then does 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So this is actually just a reprint of Shadow Bullet on Umbreon GX, but now you have this pretty half-decent solid attack on a Pokemon with a great ability which Umbreon does not have. So this is really nice. It's a nice little two-shotting attack, especially if you have a choice band on Frozen Bullet. You're going to do 120 and then maybe put 30 on a bench Pokemon, set up some knockouts. Especially in the case if your opponent has a Tapu Lele GX in play, if you get off 2 Frozen Bullets and maybe put 60 on a Lele, then you can Guzma up a Lele and take a knockout, assuming you have choice band as well. So the math actually works out pretty good for knocking out basic EXs and GXs. And like I said, this attack, it's solid. It's not broken. It's not super good. It's not like mind blowing. But really, all this card needs is a decent attack. That's really all it needs to win a game, I think, because this ability is going to bring your opponent down to a crippling start. All you need is a half decent two-shotting attack like Frozen Bullet, and you're going to be good to go, basically. And then its GX move, Polar Spear for a water and 2 colorless energy is 50 times the amount of damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. So you can kind of see the synergy here. Maybe get off a couple Frozen Bullets and set up some big Polar Spear GX plays, maybe on a big Pokemon that has like 250 hit points or 230 or something like that. So the GX move, it's okay, but it's a little bit awkward though because it does require, I think, 2 Frozen Bullets on the same target. So if you just get off 1 Frozen Bullet and put 30 on one of their Pokemon, Polar Spear only hits for 150, which is kind of awkward. I guess granted that would actually knock out a Tapu Lele, but as far as knocking out all of the big Stage 1 and Stage 2 GXs, this attack is a little bit awkward. Granted, with a choice band, you will do 180 to a Pokemon that already has 3 damage counters, and that will knock out that Pokemon, so something like a Zoroark GX or Lycanroc or something like that, or Golisopod. These are things that Polar Spear will actually knock out. So it's still a half-decent GX move. But yeah, lots of things going on with this card. I think its attack is solid. GX move, it's okay. But the ability is really what makes the card. But that just begs the question, what do you play this with? And at the time of filming, I have actually not begun to test Glaceon GX quite yet, so I don't have anything with proven results to bring to the table just yet, but we will be covering this card on the channel, so definitely stay tuned. But a couple ideas that, just off the top of my head, I feel like you could maybe retool the Ninetales deck that we've seen in the past to include this. So I'm thinking you have just some sort of Aqua Patch based Stage 1 GX attacking deck. So here's kind of in my mind what I'm thinking about. Ninetales actually is no longer a main attacker of the deck. You still play something like Octillery or Zoroark GX as well if you want to draw extra cards. You still play that. But Ninetales is now going to be a cleanup attacker. So instead of playing like a 4-3-1 count of Ninetales GX and the baby Ninetales, I think you just reduce it down to like a 2-2 count of Alolan Ninetales GX. So you try to lead the game with Glaceon. You probably play like a 4-3 or a 4-4 line of this card, and you lead the game using Freezing Stare and Frozen Bullet to, kind of like do the bulk of your work in the early game. And by that point, you can set up an Alolan Ninetales to sweep with Blizzard Edge in the late game. Since Blizzard Edge is a much stronger attack than Frozen Bullet, I think it would be better served to, clean up in the late game once your opponent has finally struggled to, get set up a little bit. So that's kind of like one of the decks I'm kind of imagining. I've seen another deck being discussed, which would be Decidueye Glaceon GX, which I think could be interesting as well. The only problem, well, I have a couple of problems with that, but I definitely think it's an interesting route to take the deck. And some people have been talking about Decidueye because with one Feather Arrow, Polar Spear's math is actually a lot better. You don't have to have Frozen Bullet damage in play, so you can actually use Feather Arrow to power up Polar Spear to take one-hit knockouts with that. Also, especially if they are having a slow start getting set up because of Freezing Stare, Decidueye can sometimes pick off low HP basics with its Feather Arrow ability. So I definitely think there is some synergy there, but it seems very clunky. I guess you don't run any grass energy. You literally just use Decidueye for the ability, and that's it. Granted, you do have the new unit energy, which we will talk about later. You do have rainbow energy, but when you play those, that decreases your odds of being able to use energy evolution on the first turn. So I think that is worth mentioning. So that's an interesting idea. I don't know how much I like that yet. I think I would literally just have to play with that and see how it does. But another deck I actually really want to try out is Quad Glaceon GX. So if you guys have followed the channel for a while, I played Quad Wobbuffet at the US Internationals last season, and it's a deck that had a lot of people talking, and Wobbuffet was just so great because it shut off abilities for so many Pokemon. I think Glaceon is kind of similar to that, but a little bit better. Wobbuffet, it shuts off abilities for non-psychic Pokemon. Well, the problem with that is it still allows things like Tapu Lele GX to use their abilities to bail them out of dead hands and stuff like that. Glaceon takes that option away. Now, granted, you can't shut off non-GX abilities, like in the case of maybe Vikavolt as an example, but you still do shut off, I think, the main abilities that matter most in the game. So with that, all you do is run a bunch of water energy and a couple double colorless energy. That way you can get out your Glaceon first turn, lock your opponent, and there the rest of the deck is just milling cards. You play Crushing Hammers, Hance Hammers, Team Rocket's Handiwork, all that type of stuff to just mill your opponent. And luckily Glaceon is a half-decent attacking Pokemon, so you can, while you're milling them, just kind of pick them off with these half-decent attacks like Frozen Bullet in the meantime. So that's actually a deck I really want to try out as well. I think the one big downside to it, unlike Sylveon GX, you don't have a way to naturally increase your consistency with something like Magical Ribbon. But I think this ability is just so oppressive that not having something like Magical Ribbon isn't even that big of a deal. So those are kind of like the main decks I'm initially considering for Glaceon, but this is a card I definitely expect to shake up the entire game. People relying on heavy counts of Tapu Lele to get set up I don't think are going to work anymore. And actually all of our lists that we're going to be posting for our testing rounds videos over the next couple weeks have lower counts of Tapu Lele and higher supporter counts because of this card. This ability is just so good not to see play, and I think Glaceon is definitely one of the highlights of this set. So if it's not on your radar, definitely put it on there. Definitely pick up a few copies of this card. I would expect nothing less than this card to be great. For the next card we're going to take a look at, it's going to be a Wash Rotom. Another one of these interesting Rotom cards with that Rotomotor ability. So again, if he has 9 or more tool cards in the discard pile, then you can attack for free. So this card is really only as good as its attack and in the context of this Rotom deck that we're talking about. So it has Wash Arrow, and it does 50 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So this is basically just Ice Blade from Alolan Ninetales GX on a Rotom. But unfortunately, I think this is just painfully underwhelming. So you might be thinking, well, Ice Blade is good on Ninetales, so why is it different for this? Well, that's because Ice Blade on Ninetales has synergy with the rest of its attacks. So first of all, Ninetales is a 210 hit point stage 1. It's much bulkier than this Wash Rotom. So also with Ice Blade as well, it does 50 damage, and then actually your Blizzard Edge does 160. So there are certain situations where you might have to Blizzard Edge, and then you can pick off Pokemon with Ice Blade. Also, Alolan Ninetales has an amazing GX attack, whereas this does not. So just sniping 50 damage on a 90 hit point Pokemon, granted for 0 energy isn't too bad, but I just really don't see how this works with the math for the rest of the Rotom deck, I guess. The only situation I can see this maybe working in is if you get off an attack with the Lightning Rotom to do 120 damage. Maybe you can pick off a Tapu Lele, but this attack definitely seems like one of the weakest out of all of the different Rotoms that we've looked at so far. And if I was going to omit any of the Rotoms from the deck, it would definitely be this one, or at the very best, I would play this as a 1 count in those like very specific situations like I just mentioned. So overall, I'm really not expecting this Rotom to be very impactful. Like I said, you could potentially play it as a one of, but this whole Rotom deck is debatably not that great to begin with. So a bad Rotom in the context of this Rotom deck just doesn't excite me at all. So unfortunately, guys, I'm gonna say this one's probably not that good. However, we do have another Water Rotom that I actually think is worth taking a look at. So we have Frost Rotom. Yet again, has that Rotomotor ability, but the attack on this one is going to be Frost Crash. So it does 10 damage, plus 20 more for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon. So this is actually a half-decent little attack. You know, if your opponent has, let's just say, 5 energy in play, you're doing 110 damage, 140 if you have a Choice Band, of course. So I think that's something you could maybe expect, especially since this whole Rotom deck is kind of, I think, supposed to be like an anti-metagame deck. If you're using this one, you're trying to use this to attack water-weak Pokemon like Volcanion, for example. In the case of Volcanion, that deck typically has a ton of energy in play. You know, it's not uncommon for that deck to have 6 to 8 energy on the board at a time. So something like Frost Rotom in conjunction with the weakness that all the different fire Pokemon have can actually be really, really good against that deck. And I could actually see you just kind of sweeping Volcanion with 1 to 2 copies of this card. So I definitely think for the purpose that this is supposed to serve in the context of the Rotom deck, I think this is definitely a good Rotom. But yet again, I'm still not sold on this Rotom deck in general. So just overall, I'm going to say wait and see on this. But again, if this Rotom deck does see play and fire is still definitely a popular type whenever this card is legal for play, I would definitely play 1 to 2 of these for your fire matchup. And it's also just a half decent attack against a number of decks. You can 2-shot most things. So it seems like an okay addition to the deck. So moving on to the Lightning Pokemon in the set, we actually are going to talk about the entire Luxray line. I think every card in this entire evolution line is worth discussing. So of course, to evolve into Luxray, we do need Shinx. So we're going to start with Shinx. There are 2 available in this set, but I think this is probably the one most people are going to gravitate towards. So this Shinx has 50 hit points and fighting weakness, which is pretty bad given that Buzzwole is currently a pretty popular Pokemon, but it does have this ability, Runaway Evolution. This Pokemon can evolve the turn it was played if it's the first turn of the player going second. So that means if you go second in the game, you can evolve any of your Shinx immediately into Luxio on the first turn of the game. So that's very nice. It helps get out your evolution pieces even quicker, which is definitely good in an evolution-based deck. That's normally the biggest challenge, is just getting your evolutions up and going. So this ability is really only as good as the quality of Luxios and Luxrays that we have, and luckily, I think they're actually pretty good. So in the context of Luxray and a Luxray deck, the Shinx is definitely really good. This is the one that I would definitely consider playing. Next up, we actually have what is the most important part of the entire deck, which might seem weird at first glance, and that is going to be Luxio, the Stage 1 form of the evolution line. So that might sound really weird. Normally, Luxray would be what we'd mainly be taking a look at, but we are mainly looking at Luxio instead. So 80 hit point, Stage 1, is weak to fighting still, which is a really, really bad weakness to have, I think, given how popular Buzzwole is. So with a single strong energy, that thing can knock you out in 1 hit. But it has this attack, Disconnect. So for just a single colorless energy, does 30 damage, and your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand during their next turn. So we have Quaking Punch printed on a 1-prize attacker. So Quaking Punch back from Seismitoad EX back in the day, which saw a ton of play all the way up until its rotation. So this attack in the past has been amazing. Now that you have things like Choice Band, you can do 60 damage instead of 30. It's also just a single colorless energy instead of a double colorless in the case of Seismitoad. So it's much easier to get this attack up and running as well. Now we've already discussed some of the downsides, and that is of course you have 80 hit points. You're weak to fighting. These are bad things. You probably are going to lose against Buzzwole, so you have to kind of build this deck around that, keeping those things in mind. So this is a really good attack because even though the format isn't quite as item heavy as it was maybe let's say last season, right now Rare Candy is a very, very popular card. You have, of course, Garchomp GX is still a popular deck. You have things like Vikavolt in the format. You have maybe upcoming metal variants that we might talk about later in this set review. So Rare Candy is definitely an important card to be able to shut off, or just in general, shutting off things like Ultra Ball, shutting off Choice Bands, Float Stones, etc. So item lock has traditionally always been pretty good. Usually any card that has an item locking ability has been played at some point in the game. So I'm expecting Luxio to be no different. So with those downsides to this card in mind, I am still going to say this card is good, but luckily it has some support for it, and that is why I am going to say it's good. Otherwise, I think Buzzwole would just be too hard for this card to deal with. So Luxio, like I said, I think it's a good card, and let's take a look at why I think it can overcome or maybe still have some staying power in a format that can exploit some of the downsides that this card has. So let's move on to Luxray first. So Luxray is a 150 hit point stage 2, seems to be kind of average amount of HP these days for stage 2, has 0 weakness, which is fantastic, fighting weakness, which again, a little bit of a bummer, but at least you have 150 hit points and you don't get knocked out by a single Jet Punch. But it also has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, your opponent's active Pokemon attacks you 30 less damage. So that means effectively you have 180 hit points. And, it gives Luxray some extra tanking potential. And it has Voltage Arrow for 2 Lightning and a Colorless. Discard all Lightning attached to this Pokemon. It does 150 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. And this attack, not that great, I hate to say. There's not really a great way to power up a Lightning at the time of filming. And you have to discard your energy every time you want to do this attack. So unfortunately, I think Voltage Arrow is probably kind of bad. So you might be thinking, well, why are we even talking about Luxray then when Luxio has a much, much better attack? And that's because we have Shining Celebi. This is a card that has been kind of lingering around waiting to see some play, and I think this is going to be the first deck that I think can really abuse Shining Celebi. So Shining Celebi is one of those Shining Pokemon, came out in the Ho-Oh Premium Collection or whatever it's called, but it has this ability that lets your Pokemon use their attacks from their previous evolutions. So what that means is we can get Luxray into play and actually use Celebi to copy Disconnect from Luxio. So at that point you have a stage 2 with effectively 180 hit points whenever you factor in this Intimidating Fang attack that attacks for a single energy, item locks your opponent, and has 0 retreat cost. This is actually very, very good. Now the only problem to this, something like Seismitoad EX in the past was a basic, so you were able to just throw down the Seismitoad, find your double colorless energy hopefully, and then use Quaking Punch. So Quaking Punch, I think, was overall an easier attack to get up and running, but I think this is definitely super good as well. Being able to tank with a 1 prize, 180 hit point Pokemon, essentially, like I said, it just seems so, so good. Item lock, like I said, really good. So I think there's definitely something here. And even if you don't want to play Luxray, maybe you play Muscle Dumbbells with Luxio. But I would argue that route might not be as good because 30 damage is not good enough. The item lock is good, but 30 damage is just too poor to, I think, warrant playing Muscle Dumbbell. So I think the right way to go is going to play Luxray with your Luxio and play some Shining Celebes. Now, we did mention, of course, it has that fighting weakness, so how are you going to deal with that? And I think the way that most people should probably initially gravitate towards trying this out is actually with the Trashalanche Garbodor. So the reason I'm saying that is because Buzzwole is kind of this deck's worst enemy, and Buzzwole is weak to Psychic. Garbodor is a Psychic type attacker. It attacks for 1 energy, so it's very easily splashable, especially since Luxio doesn't require Lightning Energy to actually use its attack. So I think Garbodor seems like a solid backup attacker to balance out your weakness you have. Also, since your opponent can't play any item cards, sometimes they're going to be left with these unworkable hands, and they might have to sycamore them away to try to get something good. So there's times where I think the Trash Launch attack on Garbator is going to be very good as a late game attacker. Maybe once you've kind of annoyed your opponent the first half, 2/3 of the game with this attack, and they finally get a bunch of items in the discard pile, you can sometimes just clean up with Garbator. That seems like, if I'm going to be testing this deck, that seems like the initial way I would gravitate towards building something around Luxray and Luxio. Now, the only downside to this is that, a lot of times on the first turn of the game, you'll use something like Bridget to get out a couple of Shinx, but if you really want to make use of, I guess, the Shinx to the best of its ability, you need to get Luxio into play as well the same turn. So you might have to play some sort of additional draw cards to make that happen. I'm not sure if you can fit Octillery or not. That means you'd be playing a thick Luxray line, a Garbator line, and Octillery, so I don't know if that'll work. Maybe you play something like Oranguru, or maybe you play Marshadow from Shining Legends as some additional draw support. I'm not sure, but I definitely think there is something here. It seems a little clunky, like at first glance, but I think the effect of this attack and being able to tank with Luxray, it seems so good not to at least try out. So I'm actually going to say this whole evolution line is good, and we'll see what happens. It might end up being too clunky, but right now I'm going to say it's good, and I feel like this will see play in some capacity. So next up on our list to talk about, we have Pachirisu, 70 hit point basic. And in the past, Pachirisu has actually had some pretty good cards. As far as all these Pika clones go, it's probably been the best one, competitively speaking, that I can think of. You had the one all the way back from, oh man, I forget the set now, but it had like the super strong Call for Family that let you get 3 Pokemon on your bench when the standard at that time was 2. So you had that. Then you also had the Pachirisu from Call of Legends that accelerated lightning energy out of the hand. And this one is no different. We have a new form of lightning acceleration in the form of Pachirisu, but it's very specific lightning acceleration. So let's take a look at it. It has static generator for a lightning energy. For each of your bench Pokemon with a Nuzzle attack, search your deck for a basic lightning energy and attach it to that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And Pachirisu does also have Nuzzle, which is worth mentioning. So why is this good? Or why is this even worth talking about? Well, this is really only good if there's good Pokemon in the format that have Nuzzle. And if you remember right, we do have a Pikachu in the format that has Nuzzle, which means you can play that with Raichu GX. And so that's really the reason I'm discussing Pachirisu. So Raichu GX I think is a strong card, but it just has kind of awkward partners right now as far as energy acceleration goes. Magnezone is far too clunky. The Stage 2 and Stage 1 lines take up far too much space for the deck run consistently. Similarly, Electrode is much more consistent, but you have to knock out Electrode to get the energy in play. Also, Electrode is susceptible to enhanced hammers as well. Pachirisu, on the other hand, I think actually might be a much more consistent form of energy acceleration. So, ideally what you do is you open with Pachirisu, you maybe play, I'll just say 3 copies of this in your Raichu deck. You go for the turn 1 Bridget, get 3 Pikachus in play, and then what you can do is you can use Static Generator and get 4 Lightning Energies in play, 5 total, counting the one that you had to attach for turn. So 5 Lightning Energy in play for Raichu GX on turn 1 seems really good. And I mean, you can still play things like Max Elixirs on top of this as well, but this seems much better. So think of Magnezone, for example. Magnezone does let you attach a ton of energy from your hand, but guess what? Magnezone takes up, if you're playing a 3/1/3 line with 4 rare candy, that's going to be a lot of deck space. That's like 11 cards that you're committing to your deck to running energy acceleration. Similarly, if you're playing a 2/2 Electrode, that's 4 spots for your deck that you're committing to a Stage 1 that you might not be able to get out all the time, and gives up a prize whenever you use it. And only gets 2 energy in play whenever you do use it. Pachirisu, on the other hand, I think is a card you can play anywhere from 2 to 4 of, and that's only 2 to 4 deck spots, but it can help you get, maybe 4 energy in play every turn. And what's nice about this is that, similarly to Xerneas, you can use this multiple turns in a row. You can just sit back with Pachirisu, use Static Generator for a couple turns until you have a ton of energy in play, and then just sweep with Raichu GX. So honestly, guys, I'm really excited for Pachirisu in the context of Raichu GX and what it can do for that card. I kind of raved about it in our set review in Shining Legends way back then. I definitely think it's a card that's very good, has a lot of potential, but just hasn't had the right partner. But I think Pachirisu finally actually might be what makes Raichu worth playing. It only gives up one prize as well, so you can force a 7 prize game with this card. And yeah, just a lot of good things going for this. It has 70 hit points, which is good because that means if you attach a lightning energy to Pachirisu, a Tapu Lele with a double colorless energy can't actually knock you out. They would need something like a Fury Belt or a Kukui in order to do it. So the 70 hit points is pretty relevant. A couple downsides though. If you are going to play this with a Raichu deck, that means you are playing the 60 hit point Nuzzle Pikachus and not the 70 hit point ones. So you are definitely going to have a horrible time against Buzzle GX. I think you already probably do, but it just makes that matchup, I think, even more unwinnable. I'd be very surprised if you could still beat Buzzwole, but I definitely think this will give Raichu a huge boost. And outside of Raichu, this Pachirisu really isn't much to talk about. There is, I believe, a Togedemaru or an Emolga that has Nuzzle as well. One of them does have a Nuzzle attack, but they're not too impressive. So outside of Raichu, there's not too much to talk about. But like I said, when you factor in Raichu GX, I definitely think this card is, certainly playable. And I think it's actually probably our best form of lightning energy acceleration for that card yet. So that's why I'm going to say Pachirisu's good. Definitely keep an eye out on it. And so up next we have the base form of Rotom. I did mention this a little bit earlier. So this is going to be our lightning type Rotom. It has that Rotomotor ability just like all of the others. And the attack on this one is going to be Plasma Slash for 120 damage, and then this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So this is actually pretty good. 120 for 0 energy is nothing to really scoff at. Granted, you can't attack on the next turn, but even things like Volcanion EX and Buzzwole GX have similar attacks and they've seen play. But Rotom is a 1 prize attacker. Granted, it only has 70 hit points, so it does get knocked out pretty easily. But nevertheless, 120 for 0 energy is pretty solid. Even if this thing gets knocked out, 120 for 0, pretty good. I will take that. So I think this is probably going to be your main attacker in the Rotom deck. That would make sense. It is the regular form of Rotom, so it makes sense that this would be one of the better ones. And then all of the other Rotoms that you're playing are kind of going to be its support and its, the text that you play to deal with very specific matchups. So this is one of the better Rotoms, like I said, in the deck. If you are going to play this Rotom box style deck, I would definitely be including maybe 2, maybe even 3 of these potentially as your main attacker. But like I've reiterated several times throughout this video, I'm not completely sold on this Rotom box deck. So that's why I'm going to wait and see on this. I'm not sure how good it's going to be, but if the Rotom box deck is good, this would be a good card for it. So I'm going to kind of stay in the middle and just say, like I said, wait and see on it. It might be good, might not. We'll see. So the next card we're going to discuss is going to be Spiritomb. It's going to be a Psychic type, 70 hit point Pokemon, has 0 weakness and 0 resistance, that's pretty good. At least you are not weak to Dark, so that is definitely good. But you do have 70 hit points, so I'd argue you probably get knocked out no matter what your weakness is. And so the reason we are taking a look at this card is going to be for its first attack, a Lightless World. For just a single colorless energy, search your discard pile for 2 supporter cards, show them to your opponent, and put them into your hand. It does have another attack called Melody, but it's not too great, I don't think. I think Lightless World is the main reason we would ever discuss this card. So, Lightless World, like I mentioned, search your discard pile for 2 cards. Seems like a good effect. It is colorless, so that means this is very splashable into a number of decks. But I'm just trying to think, what decks really need this? I wanted to discuss this card because it is a form of supporter recovery, which we don't have that much of right now. We have Lucamine, which is kind of clunky and awkward. So I felt like it was worth discussing this, but I don't see that many uses for us. But, if I am trying to scratch my brain and think of something, a couple of ideas do come to mind, though. So one consideration I would think would actually be Decidueye GX. So you can maybe play a 1 count of Spiritomb and use your Decidueyes to do the bulk of your damage, and use Lightless World at some point to get back some supporter cards while you're doing your damage with Feather Arrow. So maybe grabbing something like a Guzma or like a Sycamore or something, ready to go for next turn. Guzma in particular is always nice in Decidueye. If you can strand something in the active spot and use Feather Arrow a bunch, that is definitely a good way to go about things at times. So that could be a potential play for Decidueye, I guess. The only other situation I can think of is maybe like some sort of disruption based deck. Maybe something that plays like heavy counts of Team Flare Grunt and things like that. Lightless World could be a great way to get them back into your hand to keep stripping your opponent of their resources. So maybe you'll see like a quad Spirit Tomb deck or something crazy like that. Who knows? But I think these are probably the go-to like solutions for playing this card. But even those, I'm not that excited about. I think Decidueye has plenty of other stronger partners. You also have Hollow Hunt at your disposal if you do want to get back supporters. So, I mean, Grand Spirit Tomb only gives up one prize, and, you know, it keeps a Decidueye safe in the process, but nevertheless, I think it might just be outclassed. Also in the same set, we have a form of supporter recovery, which we will talk about later. So, again, even for most decks, if they want to get back some supporters, I don't think this will be the way they do it. I think if we ever did see this card, it would be in the context of some sort of disruption deck. So similar to the Sableye Garb deck from the expanded format, which gets back, they play things like Crushing Hammers and stuff like that, and gets them back with Sableye every turn. You could see something like that with Spirit Tomb as well, to use Lightless World to get back your Flare Grunts and Team Rocket's Handiworks and things like that. So that's the only way I think that's on my radar for this card to pop up and see play, but even then, I'm not entirely convinced just yet, especially in the expanded format. In the context of Sableye Garb, you have Puzzles of Time, which means that you can actually just double puzzle for supporters if you absolutely had to. You also have Versus Seeker as well, so I don't see this card really being that great in the expanded format with that deck. So I'm not sure, guys. I think it has some potential there, but unfortunately, I think it might just be too narrow of use to really ever see play. I think it just might be outclassed by other things. So unfortunately, I gotta say Spirit Tomb is not that good. All right, next up, guys, we have our very first Prism Star card that we are going to talk about in this set. So this is one of the new mechanics that came out in this set. It's kind of like a reimagining of the old Gold Star cards way back from the old EX format, which a lot of people I know really enjoyed. Basically, we have these Prism Star Pokemon, and the rule on them is that you can't have more than one Prism Star card with the same name in your deck. And if that Prism Star card is discarded, put it in the Lost Zone. So we are finally seeing the return of the Lost Zone, which was another mechanic back from like the late Arceus, or I'm sorry, like the late Platinum era of cards and the Heart Gold era. And basically it was like a more permanent version of the discard pile, similar to like the removed from game type of state in other card games like Magic and stuff like that. So basically, whenever something went into the Lost Zone, it never came back. There's not ways to fish cards out of the Lost Zone. In the past, though, we did have interesting cards that did affect the Lost Zone, though. Like there was the Lost World Stadium, and there were cards that had unique effects based on how many cards were in the Lost Zone. So who knows? We might see stuff like that pop up again. But as for right now, just based off the cards we have in this set, it appears that the Lost Zone, at the time of filming, for this format and set when this releases, is that it's basically just going to be a more permanent discard pile. There's no other real mechanics tied to the Lost Zone other than that right now. But who knows, that might change in the future. But yeah, so we have Giratina Prism Star. We can only have one of these in the deck, and these cards are kind of powerful, but let's take a look at this one and see what it does. So it's 160 hit point, basic, fantastic. Is weak to dark, which is pretty bad. Unfortunately, that means Zoroark GX is going to be able to knock you out pretty easily, but luckily you just give up one prize. And let's look at the ability of this. It has Chaotic Star. Whenever you play this card from your hand onto your bench, you may attach 2 Psychic Energy from your hand to this Pokemon. So it's a little bit of Psychic Energy acceleration, but unfortunately it only attaches energy to this Pokemon. Granted, it does have an expensive attack, so let's take a look at that though. Crisis Drive for 4 Psychic Energy. Discard 2 energy from this Pokemon and do 160. So with the Choice Band, of course, you will do 190, which knocks out basically any non-Stage 2 or Stage 1 GX or EX. But overall, it's just a lot of energy to do so, and it's Psychic type, so there's not a whole lot of great ways to actually get Psychic Pokemon accelerated and with a ton of energy or anything like that. So I'm not too optimistic about this as an attack, especially since there's just a lot of ways to easily knock this thing out. Even though it has 160 hit points, Gardevoir is going to make quick work of you. And like I said, Zoroark can easily knock you out as well. So I think the purpose of this card would be for its ability. So I do think there is a little bit of potential here. So we do have the Lunala GX back from Sun and Moon, and it has that nice Psychic Transfer ability. It lets you move Psychic Energy around to any of your Pokemon. So this is nice because you can play down a Giratina Prism Star, get a couple of extra Psychic Energy in play, and Lunala can actually move them to whatever Pokemon that you need them to. So I think this is probably the best use of this at the time of filming. I don't see too many other uses. You can play things like Energy Switch if you want to get this energy onto some other attackers if you don't want to play Lunala GX. But overall, I think the usage is very limited. Like, I'm not too enthusiastic about this card, but I don't want to say it's bad because the actual ability itself is pretty solid. We've seen things like this be popular in the past, like with the old Pachirisu from Call of Legends that I mentioned earlier. Getting a couple of energy in play from hand like this has been good traditionally. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out on it. Maybe Lunala GX will finally see some play. Those energy transfer abilities in the past have been great and have seen play. So maybe with the right support, Lunala GX can finally be good, and then Giratina would actually have some time to shine in that deck. So that's why I'm going to say keep an eye out for it. I like the ability, but right now at the time of filming, I don't see the potential use for it. I would not be surprised if down the line Giratina did start to pop up. So up next, guys, we have a new Cresselia. So Cresselia is 120 hit point basic. That's pretty decent, I'd have to say. Has a couple attacks that are catching my attention. The first one is going to be Crescent Moon Turn for a single Psychic Energy. Discard an energy from this Pokemon and switch all damage counters on this Pokemon with those on your opponent's active Pokemon. So this is pretty interesting. It's kind of like the damage swap attack that Mewtwo EX has, which saw an incredible amount of play during last season. So I definitely, my attention has been caught by this first attack. So let's take a look at its other attack as well. So that's Psychic. For a Psychic and 2 colorless, it is 60 plus 20 more for every energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So kind of like the Evolutions Mewtwo that we currently have, but just for an extra Psychic energy, you're doing 40 extra base damage, which seems kind of okay to me. So what do I think about this card? Well, the first attack catches my attention, but my problem with it is it has 120 hit points, which is great for a one prize basic. That's fine and dandy, but it's not enough to really tank hits and make use of this first attack, since 120 hit points is an easy amount of damage to hit for. With a full bench, Zoroark GX can knock you out in one hit, Gallade can knock you out in one hit, Gardevoir with enough energy can knock you out in one hit, Volcanion EX can knock you out in one hit. So as interesting as this attack is, I just can't be that excited about it. Granted, if you are playing something like Fighting Fury Belt, then yes, you could make use of this attack, potentially. But even still, I think that's a very hard sell. The only thing I can really think of that would excite me about this attack is maybe if you're playing... If we got a Pokemon like Reuniclus, like we have in expanded format, where you can move damage counters around, maybe if you take all of your damage counters that are in play, put them on Cresselia, and use Crescent Moon Turn, you can put those damage counters on your opponent's active. So that's something I think you could maybe do, but unfortunately this is not as good as, for example, the GX attack on Alolan Ninetales GX, which moves all of the damage counters on you to their active. You are switching all damage counters. That means if your opponent has already taken some damage, you are going to take some damage in return. So that is my problem with Cresselia. I don't think you can make a whole deck around this at the time of filming. The effect of the attack is just good, but I think it's on the wrong Pokemon, and it just does not have a place right now in any particular deck that I can see. However, I am actually a little bit more enthusiastic about the second attack, even though it is the less interesting of the two. So right now, a lot of people play Mewtwo as a way to deal with certain Psychic weak Pokemon. Also is good against things like Gardevoir GX. So that's one reason people are playing the copy of Mewtwo. And actually, I like Cresselia for the same reason. So if you were playing a deck that plays double colorless energy and rainbow energy, or psychic energy for that matter, and your deck has a hard time with something like Gardevoir, or maybe some sort of other psychic weak Pokemon like Buzzwole or Espeon GX, I think Cresselia is worth considering, actually, for the same reason that Mewtwo is worth considering. So also another big thing is that in the case of Gardevoir, Mewtwo can actually not knock out Gallade in one hit, because Gallade needs 3 energy, and unless they attach a Fairy and double colorless energy, Mewtwo cannot effectively knock out Gallade. So if you are playing Rainbow Energy and maybe, let's just say, some sort of Zoroark deck, because Zoroark is weak to fighting, which Gallade is. If you're playing Rainbow Energy as it is, then I think you could maybe play this as a one of, since this can actually knock out Gallade in one hit. So I think this could be a potential tech that could pop up in certain decks at some point. We also have the new unit energies, which we'll talk about, which are kind of similar to Rainbow Energy. So that allows for a little bit of flexibility for this card to pop up in other types of decks too. I'm not really enthusiastic about this, but I'm going to say keep an eye out for it just because it could be a half decent tech in your deck for certain matchups depending on what your deck is. So like I said, I don't think this card's great, but definitely keep an eye out on it. I'd probably pick up one of them at the least just to hang on to, because it could be a potentially decent tech in certain decks. So next up we have yet another new Prism Star we are going to talk about, and that is Lunala Prism Star. So just like with Giratina, you can only have one of these Lunala Prism Stars in your deck, and if it gets discarded, it goes straight to the Lost Zone. But this does mean you can play something like Giratina Prism Star and Lunala Prism Star in the same deck. So unlike the old Gold Stars from back in the day, which limited you to just one Gold Star in total, these Prism Stars will allow you to play one of each, which is really nice. So you can potentially play both these in the same deck if you choose to. So Lunala, 160 hit points, just like the Giratina we just mentioned, which is good, but yet again, that Dark weakness is pretty bad. Also has 3 retreat costs, which is pretty bad as well. 2 retreat costs would have been much better because Altar of the Moon reduces your retreat cost by 2. So I'm not enthusiastic about some of its base stats, but I think it does have an interesting attack though. So it has Full Moon Star for a single Psychic Energy. For each of your opponent's Pokemon in play, attach a Psychic Energy from your discard pile to your Pokemon in any way that you like. So like I mentioned earlier in the game, the current format at the time of filming is really heavily based around using a first turn Bridget and getting a bunch of Pokemon into play. So I think Full Moon Star definitely has potential because of how setup heavy the current format actually is. Psychic Energy in the past, especially in recent times, has been kind of hard to accelerate. Outside of things like Max Elixir, there hasn't been a very reliable way of getting Psychic Energy in play. So Lunala actually kind of offers a half decent way to get some in play. And unlike the Giratina that we just talked about, you can put the energy anywhere that you like, not just on Giratina. So maybe, who knows, maybe the Lunala GX archetype finally has a couple of tools as disposal to maybe pop up in the metagame and be half decent. But let's look at its other attack. It has Psystorm for 4 Psychic Energy, just like that Giratina we just talked about. It does 20 damage times the amount of all energy in play. So that's actually kind of impressive. You're doing 80 damage base with 4 energy, which is pretty terrible. 80 damage for 4 is absolutely trash. But your opponent more than likely is going to have energy in play as well. So if they just have on average of 3 energy in play, that means you're going to be hitting for about 140 damage in a lot of cases, which isn't that great for 4 energy, though, I hate to say. I think if we're looking at Lunala Prism Star, it's mainly just for that first attack. Ideally, we're accelerating Psychic Energy to other better attackers, but we do have the option to use Psystorm if we choose to, if we are going to build a deck around this card or include it in some sort of Psychic deck. But like I said, mainly I think Full Moon Star is the attack we want to look at. But that just begs the question, well, what do you pair this with? And just like in the case of Giratina, my initial knee-jerk reaction is going to be Lunala GX. But I'm just not sure how much I like that because Lunala is weak to Dark right now, and that is a horrible weakness to have with how popular Zoroark GX is. You never know, Glaceon might kind of deter people from playing Zoroark as much, I'm not sure. But, right now, I'm very hesitant to actually play a deck like this. Now, there are some other Pokemon that are worth talking about. I think one that I have been dying to be competitive at some point is Toxapex GX. Toxapex is actually weak to Psychic, which is a little bit better right now since the Trashwind Garbodor is not that popular currently. And Toxapex has a very annoying 3 Psychic Energy attack cost, which is so obnoxious to power up. Things like Max Elixirs don't work because it is a stage 1. And outside of Max Elixirs and maybe Shining Mew as an example, there's not too many great ways to actually power it up. So maybe Lunala Prism Star will finally give Toxapex a way to get powered up, because outside of Toxapex's really bad attack cost, the actual effects of its attacks are half decent, to be honest. So maybe Lunala can be good for that. So I don't know. I like this form of energy acceleration. There is a Solgaleo here in this same set, which we'll talk about, which I am much more optimistic about because it has better partners. So I'm going to say actually just keep an eye out for this card, wait and see on it. I think the effect of the attack is good, but right now I don't think it has a partner that it's just dying for. Similar to Giratina, both of these Prism Stars we just talked about have some good things going on for them, but they just don't have a perfect home quite yet, I think. So next up we have another GX we're going to take a look at. It's going to be one of the new Necrozma cards in the set. It's going to be Dawnwing's Necrozma GX. So it's 180 hit point basic, is an Ultra Beast. Weak to Dark, like we mentioned on these past couple of Psychic Pokemon we've looked at, which is terrible, terrible weakness to have right now. Fighting Resistance, which actually is pretty decent with Buzzwole running around. And then a 2 retreat cost, which is actually fine by me because you can abuse Altar of the Moon to have a lower retreat cost. So let's take a look at this card. We are mainly going to be looking at for its ability, but we can talk about its attacks as well. So it has this invasion ability. Once during your turn before you attack, if this Pokemon is on your bench, you may switch this Pokemon with your active Pokemon. So this is literally just a reprint of Rush In from Keldeo EX and the stand-in from the Zoroark from Breakthrough. Both cards have seen immense play, especially in the case of Keldeo. Keldeo is seen in just an incredible number of decks ever since its printing, just for its ability. So just being able to use this invasion ability to go to the active spot is so good because a common play that we used to see on Keldeo is you would attach a Floatstone to Keldeo, or in the case of Zoroark in certain situations too. And basically anytime you ever wanted to retreat, you just use this ability to rush in or invasion with, in the case of Dawnwing's Necrozma GX. And then since you have a Floatstone on it, you can retreat for free, which basically means all of your Pokemon in play essentially have no retreat cost, as long as you have a Floatstone on this one Pokemon. So that is an extremely, extremely powerful ability to have, and just a number of decks can make use of that. Decks that play lots of high retreating Pokemon in them, maybe something like, in the case of Tapu Bulu, this might be an easy example to illustrate. You usually want a Choice Band or a Fighting Fury Belt on your Tapu Bulu, and typically those decks have played copies of Switch to be able to get their Bulus out of the active spot while preserving their other tools. That way they don't have to attach Floatstones. But if you have something like a Dawnwing's Necrozma GX in play with a Floatstone, well, guess what? You can just always have free retreat, always keeping your tools on the Pokemon that you actually want them to be on. So it basically lets you retreat without having to attach Floatstones to Pokemon that you really don't want them on. So that's one thing I actually love about this ability. And you might be thinking, well, you just said this card is weak to Zoroark, so why would you still play it? Like, yeah, it's a good ability, but why? I mean, doesn't that basically make this card unplayable? And I would actually say no. And the reason for that is because Keldeo came out and also existed in a format where Virizion Genesect was one of the best decks in format, an entirely grass deck, which Keldeo was weak to, and that card still saw an obnoxious, ludicrous amount of play. Even in the case of Virizion Genesect, they have an ability that acted as a Pokemon catcher. Pokemon catcher still wasn't a coin flip at the time, if I remember correctly. I don't think it got its errata till right before XY, or I could be mistaken. Feel free to correct me below in the comments if I did make a mistake there. But basically what I'm trying to say, it was easy for Keldeo to get picked off by Virizion Genesect, one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck for a while when it came out. So that's why, it has the start weakness. Yeah, it's bad, but that did not deter people from playing Keldeo in the past. I don't think it will deter them from playing Dawnwing's Necrozma now. So yeah, I mean, this ability is just insane. It seems so simple, but it's just so good. Like I said, with a Floatstone, you have free retreat. If you're playing Altar of the Moon, you have free retreat. And this just opens up so many different cool options for decks, I think. But, the ability is amazing, but let's talk about the rest of the card at least. See if it has any attacking potential. So the first attack is Flash of Darkness for 3 Psychic Energy, does 120, and it's not affected by resistance. So this is kind of okay, I suppose. You're going to two-shot basically everything in the format. If you really want to, you could play Weakness Policy to get rid of your weakness, since you're two-shotting everything anyways. So you always do have that option. I'm not sure how good that is, but you do have that option at the least. And the not being affected by resistance is half decent, since Metal does look to be becoming an increasingly better type after Ultra Prism. So the resistance part of this attack is like kind of decent, I guess. And then its GX move for the same attack cost, Eclipse Moon GX, 180 damage, and this attack can only be used if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent. Prevent all effects of attacks, including damage done to this Pokemon during your opponent's next turn. So this is actually a fantastic GX move. This is a really, really good GX move with a Choice Band. You hit for 210. So you're knocking out basically everything other than a Gardevoir GX in one hit. And then not taking any damage on your next turn as well. So this GX move, like I said, absolutely great. Really love this GX move. The regular attack is okay as well. But right now, I think the biggest thing going against this Pokemon as an attacker is going to be that pesky Dark weakness, like I mentioned. So as just like a utility card, as a one-of in your deck, I think it's fine to run this. But if your entire deck is based around this card, Zoroark is just going to eat you alive, unfortunately. And I don't think you can play this as a main attacker in the current format. But who knows, maybe you play something else to maybe deal with the Zoroark. I think that maybe some sort of tech. Maybe you play like Gallade, Dawnwing's Necrozma or something like that. Some sort of colorless attacking fighting Pokemon. I'm not sure. But the attacks are actually half decent on this thing. It's just its weakness is so bad. But as far as energy acceleration, ways to power this thing up, we have Max Elixir. This thing is a basic, so that means Max Elixir might actually be an effective way of powering it up. We also, of course, have the Giratina Prism Star. You can play that with Energy Switch. And then, of course, we have that Lunala Prism Star that we just mentioned as well, which can get a lot of energy into play. And so Lunala Prism Star typically has that 3 retreat cost, but if you're playing Dawnwing's Necrozma anyway, you can always just use Invasion to get out of the active spot. So I actually think there's a decent amount of ways to power up this card since it is a basic. That's really the only reason I think it has potential as an attacker. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, its weakness is just so terrible. At the current time of filming, I would not expect to see this pop up right now. But if the metagame shifts and Zoroark sees a decrease in play, I think you could potentially see this pop up just because the GX move and the ability are so good on this thing. So for that reason, I'm still going to say this card is good. The ability is just, it's worth it. Like I said, Keldeo still saw play in spite of Virizion Genesect running around. So for that reason, I'm expecting to still see Dawnwing's Necrozma see play for this ability. So making the return into the TCG, we actually have the fossil Pokemon coming back. And so for this one, we are going to be taking a look at Rampardos. Since this is a set based on Diamond and Pearl, of course, we have the fossil Pokemon from that era in the set. So Rampardos is a 150 hit point stage 2 Pokemon. And that's actually really important to note because in the past we had the restored Pokemon and their evolutions were stage 1s or stage 2s. But marking kind of the return of the older mysterious fossil mechanic from way back in the day, fossil Pokemon now evolve from a item card and basically their final evolution is considered a stage 2. So that means we can actually rare candy into this thing from the fossil that we have to get into play. So kind of cool, makes the fossil Pokemon a little bit easier to get in play than before. We'll talk more about Mysterious Fossil once we get to the trainer cards of this set, but just know these fossils are easier to get in play than they used to be with the old restored Pokemon mechanic. So that's the first thing this card has going for it. Is definitely much easier to get in play than any of the other fossil Pokemon that came before it. So let's take a look at it. It has an attack called Clean Hit for a single fighting energy. It is 60. And if your opponent's active Pokemon is an evolved Pokemon, this attack does 60 more damage. So that's actually pretty good because that means you knock out a Zoroark GX for 1 energy. That's super good actually. But just in general, that's 2-shotting most Pokemon in the current format. You're also knocking out things like Silvally GX in 1 hit. Not that Silvally has seen the most play, but nevertheless still a Pokemon you can easily take care of. But yeah, so 120, it is great. You're 2-shotting things like Gardevoir, 2-shotting things like Golisopod. So just in general, this attack is super good, I think. Unfortunately, though, if you're going against a basic Pokemon, you might struggle a little bit. But I'd still argue that this attack is still solid because with a Choice Band, you're going to be doing 90 damage to GXs and EXs. And luckily, most of the GXs and EXs that are basics only have 90 hit points. So either way, you're still going to be 2-shotting these GXs and EXs that your opponent has in play. So this attack is super good, and I think it's the reason this card might see some play, if any at all. But then it has another attack called Wild Bomber for 3 fighting energy. If your opponent's active basic or active Pokemon is a basic, it's just knocked out, like straight up. This is the return of the old takeout Machamp from way back in the day that knocked out basics. Granted, Machamp knocked him out for a single fighting energy, but nevertheless, the effect of the attack is going to be the same. And I know this has caused a little bit of discussion about this card, but honestly, as amazing as this ability is, I don't think it's that great. Because it does take 3 fighting energy. Unfortunately, there's not a reliable way of accelerating fighting energy. Yes, we do have Carbink Break, which seems to be the first thing anyone brings up when we have these awkward to power up fighting Pokemon, but Carbink Break is just not that good anymore since there's not that many EXs in the current metagame. You can't wall against them and accelerate energy like you used to. And this is not a basic like Buzzwole, so that means you can't play things like Max Elixir to power it up. So honestly, I don't think the second attack will see much play. There are situations where it could be good, you know, maybe getting your last knockout on a Tapu Lele for the game. If you can manage to get 3 energy on this thing and Guzma up a Lele, you can just instantly win that way instead of having to 2-shot it. So I think there is consideration to use this attack at some point in the game, but this is not an attack you build this deck around. It's not one that you're going to use very often, I think. I think the star of the show is going to be Clean Hit. Clean Hit is a great 2-shotting attack, and because it only costs 1 fighting energy, that means you can abuse things like Max Potion as well. So luckily you have 150 hit points, which is pretty solid. On a 1-prize Pokemon, if your opponent attacks you and they don't knock you out, you can Max Potion, discard that 1 energy, and attach another energy and keep on swinging. Now, of course, certain things in the format are going to knock you out in 1 hit, things like Glaceon GX, since you are weak to Grass, just as an example. But a lot of things I think will have to 2-shot you. Things like Zoroark GX will have to 2-shot you. You know, Lycanroc can 2-shot you. They can potentially knock you out in 1 hit too, but Lycanroc's normal attack will just usually do maybe 130 damage on average with 1 strong energy. Gardevoir is going to have to 2-shot you more than likely, I would say, just because they would need 4 energy, I believe. And I mean, that's definitely workable, but you know, that's still not too bad. So I think a lot of times people are going to be 2-shotting your Rampardos, allowing you to tank with Max Potions and, you know, abuse this nice little 1 energy attack. Since, like I said, if you have a choice band, you're 2-shotting basically everything no matter what. And once you factor in things like strong energy too, you have other ways to augment your damage from there. So I'm sounding kind of positive about this card, and you might be thinking, well, why are you not saying it's good? Why are you only going to say, you know, wait and see on it? Why are you kind of staying in the middle? Well, because you can't bridge it for fossils. That is going to be the big downside to these fossil Pokemon. Yes, they're easier to get out than they used to be back in the day with the restored mechanic, but unfortunately you can't bridge it for your fossils. There's not a reliable way to search out fossils out of your deck, so that makes getting Rampardos up online a little bit trickier. The fossils count as colorless Pokemon when they're in play, so you can't abuse things like Brooklet Hill to get out your evolution pieces and things like that. So those are the major things that are going against this card. You know, I like the first attack. It's very, very strong. Anything that can knock out a Zoroark GX for 1 energy and only give up 1 prize is half decent at the least. But I think it has a couple of things going against it that right now really concern me about how competitive this thing actually is. With the right support, I will say I think this card actually could be very good. But at the time of filming, I think, you know, I could be wrong, but I think it might not be quite good enough to really break out and have a lot of competitive play. But you never know. Like I said, if the right support comes along for fossil Pokemon, I would definitely expect to see this Pokemon you know, pop up at some point. It has a great attack. Like I said, even the second attack, if you can manage to power it up, it is good. But that first attack, being able to just attack for 1 fighting energy, having fighting support like strong energy in the format, and only giving up 1 prize, there's a lot of good things going on for this card, but I think right now it just needs a little bit more support before it actually sees play. So next up we have quite another interesting Pokemon. We have Lucario. And it's actually funny, back in our Burning Shadows set review, Marcus was actually saying, you know, like, this always happens with Lucario. They always print, like, cards that are, like, interesting, but not ever good. And I think this Lucario kind of falls into both categories. It's definitely an interesting card, but it might actually be a card that finally sees play. So let's take a look at it. It has 110 hit points on stage 1, that's fine and dandy. Has this attack called Scud Jab for a fighting in colorless to 70, and it's not affected by resistance. So that's okay, 70 for 200 with a choice band. It's okay. With a strong energy, you do knock out Zoroark GX and a choice band, so that's like okay, I guess, but that's not the reason we're really looking at this card. We're looking at for its ability Aura Sight. Once during your turn before you attack, if you have any Garchomp in play, you may search your deck for one card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. Okay, so that's actually really interesting. So being able to search your deck for any card has pretty much always been great. We've had computer search in the past. We had Pidgeot back from Fire Red, Leaf Green. So these types of effects are nothing to scoff at. This is definitely a very, very powerful ability. Of course, the only downside is you have to have Garchomp in play. We do have a new Garchomp, which we will talk about later, but Lucario is part of a new archetype that this set is kind of setting up for us that revolves around this in Garchomp and a new supporter card. And so, yeah, basically, if you have a Garchomp in play, this card is amazing. Searching your deck for any card every turn. So Garchomp, for example, needs Cynthia. It's a new supporter, which we'll talk about more in depth, to do large amounts of damage. So Lucario can easily just search out that supporter every turn and use that if you want to. So that's, I think, the main strategy here. But there's a lot more you can do with this. So one thing I'm actually excited to potentially try out is Puzzle of Time. So a lot of times Puzzle of Time is a good card, but a lot of times it's hard getting two puzzles in your hand at the same time to use. Lucario, I think, helps with that. And I think that's a potentially interesting route you could go with this if you're running your Garchomp deck. You can also search out maybe a lot of tech cards that might be hard to search out otherwise. It's just a huge consistency booster, especially if you get maybe two of these in play. Searching your deck for any two cards every single turn is absolutely crazy. I mean, if your only Garchomp gets knocked out, you're going to be in some trouble. But assuming you get Garchomp in play, you see a giant consistency boost from this thing. Garchomp only gives up one prize, Lucario only gives up one prize, so I think there's a lot to really talk about here. But this Lucario is basically only as good as the quality of Garchomps that we have, because if you don't have Garchomp in play, card's not that good. Pretty worthless otherwise. So we'll have to see how good Garchomp is. We'll get to him shortly, but that's really going to determine the quality of this card. It is worth noting too, in Expanded, we do have a Garchomp back from Dragon's Exalted, which is a decent attacker. It does 60 for 1 energy and discards special energy, and actually has a decent amount of support, so you could potentially play this with that Garchomp if you so choose to. We do have a Garchomp from Breakpoint, which is actually still legal at the time of filming too. So there are a few Garchomps we could potentially make use of, but the main one we're going to be talking about for this card is going to be the new one that is coming out of Ultra Prism. So, with all that being said though, I think this card is definitely interesting. I think it's really only as good as the quality of the entire Garchomp deck, so for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out on this, but this is definitely not an ability to overlook. This thing is absolutely great if Garchomp is good. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out on it, and basically just keep your fingers crossed and hope Garchomp is good. That way Lucario can finally see some play. And next up in the set, we have another Passimian. So this actually kind of goes hand in hand with the old Passimian from Sun and Moon. That's kind of what they're going for here. So let's take a look at it and see what it's all about. It has that ability, Power Scrum. As long as this Pokemon is on your bench, each of your Passimian's attacks does 30 more damage to your opponent's active evolved Pokemon. So this is actually kind of interesting. So the Passimian back from Sun and Moon is a card that's seen play here and there, but it's always fallen a little bit short, I think, of being great. So the Passimian from Sun and Moon has that attack team play for a double colorless energy, does 10, plus 30 more for every Passimian you have on your bench. And luckily for this one, it wants to be on your bench to get use of this ability. So if you have 3 Passimian on your bench, you're doing basically 100 damage with the Passimian from Sun and Moon, which is it's okay, I guess. You do have things like Choice Band you can abuse to do 130 damage. You also have the Mew from Fates Collide that basically acts as an additional 30 damage from there. So you can do essentially 160 damage with Mew in play and all 4 Passimian on your bench. So that seems kind of interesting. But the deck has always been just a little bit shy of taking one-hit knockouts, and unfortunately this new Passimian does not change that. So here's my big gripe with this card, is that it only limits your damage output done to your opponent's evolved Pokemon. And that is, I think, the real reason why I am not that excited for this card. So if you use Mew, first of all, you don't get the benefit of this ability because you have to attack with a Passimian. So that means that's automatically one less Passimian that you have on your bench. So you're only hitting for 100 damage if you're attacking with one of your actual Passimian and not Mew. So that's the first thing. So you're doing 100 damage right now. If two of your Passimians on your bench, because I think that's really all you can afford to play in this deck, are these new ones from Ultra Prism, you're hitting for 160 damage, which is good. Then if you have a Choice Band, you're hitting for 190. But oh wait, this only hits for evolved Pokemon, and there's not any evolved GXs or EXs with 190 hit points. Unfortunately, they all kind of start around the 200 mark. But on the plus side, you do have things like Regirock EX, for example, as a way to boost your damage. So, of course, if you do have a Choice Band, two of these Passimians, and a Regirock, you are hitting for 200 damage, which is going to knock out things like Glaceon GX, which is very important to note, actually. Basically, all of the evolutions, you knock out Lycanroc GX in one hit as well. If you factor in Professor Kukui, you can hit for 220, which is going to knock out basically all of the other stage ones like Golisopod GX, Zoroark GX as well. Zoroark you already kind of easily deal with because you're fighting anyways, but nevertheless, you're pretty much making quick work of stage 1 GXs. But my problem, it just requires a ton of different elements in play in order to be able to pull that off. And that's really my problem with this, is that I really wish this ability applied to any Pokemon, not just evolved Pokemon, because that means it'll be a little bit easier to take a knockout on your opponent's basic EXs and GXs. Granted, I will say this ability actually really does help in knocking out things like Gallade and some of the non-GX evolutions that we currently have in the format, so that is worth noting. But even still, I think it just unnecessarily, like the stipulation that your opponent's active has to be an evolution is just a little unnecessary. I don't think even if it was any Pokemon play that it would make this deck broken. I'm not sure if it would even make it see an extreme uptick in play. So I'm definitely a little bit I'm a little bit skeptical, unfortunately. Like I said, if you get a Passimian in play with a Choice Band, two of these on the bench, a Regirock, all of that good stuff, you will hit for 200, which is pretty decent. But again, that's only on evolutions. So there's definitely some things going against Passimian here. But, going forward, if this Passimian deck is going to keep seeing play at any point, I would imagine we'll probably see 1 to 2 of these splashed in to just help with the math against stage 1 GXs if the deck already doesn't have a good matchup against them. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it, but I just wish the stipulation of the ability was an evolution Pokemon. If it said any Pokemon, I'd probably say this card is good, but unfortunately because of that, I'm going to just kind of be in the middle there and say just keep an eye out for it. It might be good, might fizzle out, we'll see. So we also have a new Weavile in the set. Let's talk about this guy. So it has 90 hit points, it's a stage 1, fighting weak, 1 retreat cost, nothing too crazy there, though fighting weakness is a little bit of a bummer. But it does have a very interesting attack. It has Dark Command for a single Dark Energy. It does 50 times the number of opponent's Pokemon with abilities. So that's actually kind of interesting. We have the other Weavile that does 60 to all of your opponent's Pokemon with abilities. So I think there's a little bit of synergy between these two Weaviles. Maybe they're trying to say, hey, maybe you spread some damage with the other Weavile and set up some knockouts for Dark Command. So I think that's kind of what they're going for. And this attack is very interesting. So let's look at something like... in the case of Gardevoir GX, almost every Pokemon in the deck has an ability outside of the low HP evolving basics and Alolan Vulpix. So let's say your opponent has 2 Gardevoir, a Tapu Lele, and an Octillery in play. What is that, like 200 damage with Dark Command, 230 with a Choice Band, minus 20 for resistance though. So it is a little bit interesting. If you're going against a deck that has a ton of abilities, this attack is pretty good. The only downside is that your opponent can definitely choose to play around this thing, not benching excessive amounts of Tapu Leles and things like that. But this attack is good against a number of decks. Take the recent Zoroark Lycanroc deck that won the Memphis Regional. Almost every Pokemon in the deck has an ability. Usually Lycanroc, Zoroark, and Tapu Lele are the Pokemon that are always in play. They all have abilities. So Weavile actually could put in some work against a deck like that. And, it's It's pretty interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about it because, like I said, your opponent can choose to play around it. It only has 90 hit points, so it does get knocked out pretty easily. But nevertheless, this attack is pretty strong, I feel like. It just it really just depends on what decks are going to be popular in the metagame that this is going to be released into. That's going to be the big thing. And if your opponent can successfully play around it, if they're forced to bench, excessive Tapu Lele's to get set up and things like that, Weavile might be able to make quick work of them. But if not, you're going to really struggle. And for that reason, I think Weavile is probably best as an alternate attacker. I don't really see you building a deck just around Weavile, just because its damage output is basically contingent on what your opponent is using. So that's why I don't think this can be a main attacker, but I could see this potentially being some sort of backup attacker. It might even be the type of attacker that makes Darkrai relevant again. So Turbo Darkrai and Darkrai EX hasn't been that good in quite some time. It's been struggling with a lot of decks that have been currently in the format. Gardevoir GX has been a big one. Also, the new Lycanroc Zora Arc deck will be tough for it to deal with. But for example, Weavile would improve its matchups against those types of decks. So who knows, maybe Weavile could be a good support Pokemon in the format. But right now, I'm just kind of unsure about how I feel about it. I thought the last Weavile that we got was interesting as well. Doing 60 to everything with abilities was, kind of good. But similarly, I just didn't know what deck that fits into. And I kind of feel the same way about Weavile, or this new one. So I'm thinking I like this one better than the last one that we got, but I'm still struggling to see where it just perfectly fits into. So for that reason, I'm just going to say keep an eye out for it, but I actually am a bit optimistic about this one. I would not be surprised if a player found a good use for this Weavile and it did break out into the competitive scene at some point. But just right now at the time of filming, I just don't know where it fits into. Like I said, Darkrai could be a decent option. Also, decks that play Rainbow Energy, of course, could potentially make use of this as well to maybe deal with a bad matchup that they have. So I don't know, guys. It's definitely interesting, but I'm not sure where it fits into. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out on it, but it very well could be a good card at some point. And speaking of Darkrai, we do have yet another Prism Star. This one is going to be Darkrai Prism Star. So of course, as I've mentioned, you can only have one Prism Star card with the same name in your deck, and if they ever get discarded, they go into the Lost Zone instead. So Darkrai is actually very similar to the Giratina because they have similar abilities. So this one has Nightmare Star. Whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you may attach 2 Dark Energy from your hand to this Pokemon. That's actually pretty relevant. So let's look at attack and we'll go from there. It also has an attack Abyssal Sleep for a monstrous 4 Dark Energy, does 120, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now asleep. Your opponent flips 2 coins instead of 1 between turns. If either is tails, that Pokemon is still asleep. So definitely some interesting things going on with Darkrai. The attack, honestly, I think it just costs too much. If this was 3 Dark Energy, I would be more optimistic about the chances of using this Darkrai as an attacker. But because it's 4 energy, I think that just narrowly makes this attack a little bit unplayable. The effect of the attack is good though, and it kind of nicely two-shots your opponent. But this is going to be mainly looked at for this ability, Nightmare Star. So similar to the Giratina, you're getting excess energy in play whenever you bench it. And unlike Giratina, I definitely think there is a clear-cut deck that this would actually benefit, and that, of course, is Turbo Darkrai, which has kind of fallen off the radar the past couple sets. But with this Darkrai Prism Star, that does actually give the deck a little bit more aggression and allow you to get some extra energy in play even quicker. So between this and Max Elixirs, who knows, maybe Turbo Dark could potentially make a comeback into the game. Now, of course, Darkrai still has a ton of problems just as a deck. It loses to things like Gallade, Lycanroc, Buzzwole. But we just mentioned that Weavile could also be a new potential partner as well. So between Weavile and this Darkrai Prism Star, who knows, maybe Turbo Dark as an archetype will pop back up. It's hard to say. If I had to be honest, I would be a little surprised if it did become a great deck again, but nevertheless, it certainly gets a boost, if nothing else. I'm not sure if it will ever be tier 1 in the next format, but nevertheless, like I said, if you are a Darkrai player, the deck does look to get a little bit better. In expanded format, this card is also interesting because you have Skyfield in the Turbo Dark variant in expanded, so of course you can bench this, get a couple more energy into play that way, and definitely I could see it having some success in expanded as well. So overall, I do like this Darkrai card, but right now I feel like Turbo Dark as a deck is just not well positioned in the current metagame. So for that reason, this card probably won't see a lot of play at the time when it's initially released, but I do still like this ability. I think it has potential. I would still at the least, pick up a copy of this card in case Turbo Dark becomes viable in Standard again. I do like it, but like I said, I just don't think it's well positioned at the time of filming, but nevertheless, keep an eye out on it. It could actually be good. Up next, we have another one of the few Alolan or Gen 7 Pokemon that are in this set. We have Alolan Dugtrio. This card is the definition of a meme deck. This is definitely an interesting card. It's gotten a little bit of attention, but let's go over and see what it's all about. So we have Alolan Dugtrio. It's a 60 hit point stage 1. Oh man, so this card is... It's not very sturdy. You're not going to be tanking many hits with this thing other than maybe like from a Tapu Koko promo or something like that. So this card is definitely not the sturdiest of attackers, but let's look at it for so for a whopping 0 energy. It has Gold Rush. Discard as many metal energy from your hand as you like. This attack does 30 damage for each energy discard in this way. And just as a little bit of a disclaimer, Bulbapedia has a different translation, which I have listed in the video, but most people seem to think it is the other translation that I just spoke out loud. So I want to put the other one on screen just in case the translation is different when the card finally comes out, but most of us believe that it is the translation where you discard energy from your hand. So I just want to point that out there real quick. So yeah, discard as many metal energy from your hand as you like. Does 30 for every energy discard in this way. Okay, so yes, you will probably beat Gardevoir with this card. But beyond that, I gotta say guys, I am not too excited about this thing. So let's talk about it though. 30 times the amount of energy you discard. That means to do 180, which is kind of your baseline number that I think most decks need to be able to hit for. You have to discard 6 energies from your hand. You need to discard 8 if you want to do 240 and knock out, GXs and things like that that are stage 2s. Maybe 7 with a choice band. So you have to have a hand of 7 energy. 7. How are you going to do that? So there are some ways. Let's talk about them though. So we have a new stadium in this card, or in this set coming out, that will let you get metal energy from your discard pile back to your hand, 2 to be specific. So that's 2 energy. You're going to be guaranteed 60 damage, 90 if you have a choice band. There are things like energy retrieval to maybe get another couple back to your hand. There are things like Rabombi that will let you search for energy out of your deck. There's also things like Octillery you can still play. But you're going to need to play a lot of energy in your deck to make this thing work, because you need to be able to naturally draw into a certain amount of energy and also a combination of these other different effects at retrieving energy to make this attack worthwhile. So maybe Zoroark GX is a potential partner as well, because you can discard the metal energy and get them back out with some of these things we're discussing. There's also Fisherman as well, which will let you get 4 out of your discard pile. So that's 120 damage, or 150 with a choice band. But overall, guys, this is... I can't get behind this card. I really can't. Yes, the potential is there for some crazy knockouts, and I don't doubt that maybe at some point you can get a ridiculous knockout, but it's just so hard to get that many energy into your hand. It just really is. This card kind of reminds me of Gourgeist in a way. So Gourgeist, its damage output is based on how many tools that you discard. And granted, there's a lot more ways to recover energy than tools, to be fair. But one thing that's great about Gourgeist is that you discard your tools from play, not from hand. Because what that means is you can attach a bunch of tools to your Pokemon, play something like a Professor Sycamore, and draw a bunch of more cards trying to draw into your tools. You can't do that with Dugtrio. You have to, if you have a bunch of energy in play, let's just say you have 4 energy in play, but it's not enough to take a knockout. Well, guess what? You can't play a Professor Sycamore at that point, or try to play like an N or something to get more energy at that point, just because those existing energy that are already in your hand are going to go back into the deck or hit the discard pile. So that's just the big problem with Dugtrio. If this was discard metal energy from play, I'm not sure. But the fact that you need so many energy to effectively take knockouts really deters me from ever seeing this as like a viable card. Now, granted, if you are playing against Gardevoir GX, I would argue you can probably beat them. You know, it's not too hard to knock out something that's weak to metal. But everything else I think you're going to struggle with a little bit, and this thing gets return KO'd so easily. So every turn you're going to essentially need a new Dugtrio to get into play, and you're going to need, what, like 7 energy on average to knock out Stage 1 GXs and things like, and Stage 2 GXs if you have Choice Band. It just needs so much. And I just don't see it happening, unfortunately, guys. I think you can probably consistently hit for like 120, 150 with this thing. I just, you know, just my knee-jerk reaction that it's just too difficult to every turn have a new Dugtrio and have 7 to 8 energy ready to be discarded. So for that reason, guys, I gotta say the card's bad. I just don't think it's good. If this was 40 times the amount of energy, I think the math would be decent enough at that point to where you could maybe justify playing this, but it's just not quite there. I don't see it, guys. It definitely has a lot of support, but I think it's just too awkward and requires too many cards every turn to effectively get a knockout. So for that reason, you know, it's a very interesting card. I think you can maybe steal some wins with it, but I just don't think it's quite good enough. So unfortunately, guys, I'm not going to say it's that good. Alright, so here's where things get a little bit more interesting. We finally have some of the new metal support that is coming out in the set that might potentially give Gardevoir a run for its money. So we have a new Magnezone. It's a Stage 2, has the ability Magnetic Circuit. As often as you like during your turn, you may attach a metal energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. So this is basically just like the metal counterpart to the Lightning Magnezone that we already have, but instead of accelerating lightning energy, you're accelerating metal energy. And that is pretty good. These abilities have been good in the past. We had the Deluge Blastoise, which saw an immense amount of play. We had Emboar with that Inferno Fandango ability. We had the Rain Dance Blastoise going all the way back to base set 1. Even the Magnezone from Breakthrough saw little bits of play at Cities whenever it first came out. So these abilities historically have been good. And with Gardevoir currently being in the format, even though it did not perform that well at Memphis Regionals, it managed to get 9th though, I believe. But despite not making top 8 at the last major event, I think Magnezone is still worth considering. Gardevoir is still popular enough to consider this card. It does have an attack too though. It has Zap Cannon, so for 3 metal and a colorless does 130, and it can't use Zap Can during your next turn. So if your opponent does try to Guzma your Magnezone, you do have an attack to fall back on, but hopefully this is not the attack you are going to be using most of the game. So this card is, I think, really just as good as the potential partners that it has. So when we're thinking about metal Pokemon in the current format, we have Celesteela GX, which has been seeing some play here and there. We have Registeel, of course. We have Cobalion. We have Scizor EX. There are some decent metal Pokemon in the current format, but we do have a new attacker that we will cover here shortly that can be potentially a main attacker for this Magnezone style deck. So this Magnezone is basically really just only as good as the potential attackers that it has, you know, at its disposal. But you know, I really like this ability. Like I said, it's been good in the past. The one downside to it is that these types of decks are very susceptible to things like N, because you are very reliant on always playing cards from your hand to basically carry out your strategy. So decks like this are going to be very susceptible to N, especially the new Dusk Mane Necrozma GX, which we'll talk about shortly, requires energy every turn. So this could potentially be a deck that gets very hurt by N, so you might need to play something like an Oranguru or an Octillery or something like that as a means of, you know, kind of making your deck N-proof. But like I said, I definitely think this card is worth trying out, just if for no other reason than the fact that Gardevoir GX is so popular. And also you have to remember we have that new Glaceon GX coming out as well, which is weak to metal. So maybe to keep Glaceon in check, you can play some sort of Magnezone deck, which actually doesn't have its ability shut off by Glaceon either. That is one thing that is important to note. So you never know, Magnezone, just because of its typing alone and the attackers that exist for it, it might be enough to actually make this archetype good. So because of that, I'm going to say Magnezone is good. I'm not sure if this is going to be the primary form of metal acceleration in the format or not, but especially until the new Solgaleo GX promo comes out in March, I could definitely see this being a card that sees play. So for the other fossil Pokemon from Gen 4, we have a new Bastiodon. So Bastiodon is 160 hit point stage 2. Similarly to Rampardos, these do evolve from the fossil, so that means whenever you get a mysterious fossil into play, you can rare candy into Bastiodon to more easily get it out. So definitely much easier to get out than Bastiodons of the past. But it has this ability Earth Shield. So prevent all damage done to your metal Pokemon from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon with any special energy attached to them. Whoa. Okay, so that is most certainly a great ability. So let's look at the current format. You have Golisopod variants, which all play double colorless energy. Some play rainbow energy. You have Zoroark variants, which all play special energy, double colorless energy. You have Gardevoir variants, which all play special energy. Then you're also playing metal Pokemon on top of that too, so you're probably beating Gardevoir. Lycanroc and Buzzwole variants play strong energy, so special energy there as well. So there is a lot of special energy in this current format, and Earth Shield is definitely a great ability. So you might be looking at the rating I've given this card and might be thinking, well, you seem to be kind of enthusiastic, so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that it doesn't have a great attack, so it has push down. For 2 metal and a colorless does 110, and your opponent switches their active with one of their benched if you have them choose to do so. That's not that good, because if you're running this Stage 2 Bastiodon, you would have to run something like a Stage 2 Magnezone in addition to that to effectively power this thing up. You might be able to make the argument that because of its ability, maybe you are afforded the luxury of being able to power this thing up manually, but I am not that optimistic. So that's the first thing. It has an unplayable attack. So basically that means this is going to be a support Pokemon for another deck. And the reason I'm saying this card probably won't see play is because it gets outclassed by other Pokemon. So if you are playing a metal deck and you're playing a Stage 2, you're probably going to play the new Magnezone instead, because Magnezone actually helps you carry out your strategy. Bastiodon does not. Bastiodon is kind of like a win more type of card. So you might be preventing damage done to your metal Pokemon, but you might not be able to get your metal Pokemon up and running efficiently, maybe allowing some wiggle room for your opponent to just manually attach basic energies and attack you that way instead. And that's basically what it comes down to. In addition to that, like I mentioned with Rampardos, you actually cannot bridge it out the fossils. Well, at the time of filming, that is the current ruling, at least that we know of. You won't be able to bridge it out these fossils since they only count as colorless Pokemon when they're in play. So you don't really have an effective means of getting out Mysterious Fossil to actually evolve into Bastiodon to begin with. And on top of that, you would have to run kind of a thick count of this card if you want to get it out quickly and efficiently. So you might have to run like a 2-1-2 line of this. And it's just a lot of deck space for a card that does not help you actually carry out your deck's main strategy. However, maybe if you have attackers that are, one energy cost or 2 energy costs and are very easy to get going, maybe you could make a case that Bastiodon could be a better partner than Magnezone. But I'm thinking in the case of things like the new Dusk Mane Necrozma, these are kind of the big metal attacking Pokemon that I think are probably the best, and Bastiodon really does not help at efficiently setting those Pokemon up and carrying out their core strategies. So for that reason, guys, I hate to say it, but I don't think Bastiodon will see that much play. Now, however, I could be wrong if they make an efficient way at getting out fossils and getting fossil Pokemon set up. But at the time of filming, since you can't even bridge out the fossils, I don't have much hope for Bastiodon at the moment. The ability is great, but it just requires too much deck space to really get up and going. And like I said, does not help with the metal decks, core strategy that they need to carry out to win to begin with. So we have a new potential metal attacker, and that is going to be Heatran. So Heatran is a 130 hit point basic. That's all fine and dandy. Weak to fire, 3 retreat cost, all kind of expected things, I guess, from this Pokemon. But we're looking at for its attack, Boiler Impact for 2 metal and a colorless does 130 damage, and discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So the reason we're looking at this is because this is actually a very, very efficient way at knocking out something like a Gardevoir GX. So not only are you taking a one-hit knockout on Gardevoir because of its weakness to metal, but you're also discarding its energy, which means it's going to be harder for Gardevoirs to return KO you, and it's going to force them to set up Gallade instead. But you might be thinking, well, why the bad rating for this card? That's honestly because it's just outclassed. It's not that it's really that bad of a card. There's just other things that do the same thing that have more utility and are better. So I'm mainly thinking of Registeel from Crimson Invasion when I'm saying this, because Registeel It does 90 for the same attack cost, and so with a choice band, you are knocking out Gardevoir. So you're already doing the same thing as long as you have a choice band. But more importantly, Registeel has a great first attack. For a single metal energy, it can actually accelerate energy out of your discard pile. And if you are thinking about cards that can beat Gardevoir, Registeel can easily knock out benched Raltses and even Ralts that are in the active spot. You can also knock out things like Alolan Vulpix. Registeel is not only a great early game attacker, it also can still one-shot a Gardevoir, only giving up one prize. So that is the reason I just don't think Heatran will see play. Again, it's not because it's a bad card. It's fine for the job that it does. It's a good Gardevoir killer, but there's just other things that do the same thing but better. So unfortunately, there's not really too much to say about Heatran beyond that. 130 damage is solid. It will two-shot a lot of things, or one-shot Gardevoir. But like I said, Registeel I think is just a better way to do it. Genesect EX also similarly can do the same thing, but better since it can also take one-hit knockouts by discarding additional energy. So for that reason, like I said, Heatran I don't think it'll see play, but it's not the worst card in the world, just outclassed by better things. So up next we have a Pokemon I am more enthusiastic about. We have another new Prism Star. This is going to be Solgaleo Prism Star. And of course, as with the others, you can only have one of these in your deck, and they go to the Lost Zone instead of being discarded. So this is a card I'm actually pretty excited for, and mainly it's going to be for that Rising Star attack. Similar to the Lunala Prism Star, just for a single energy, this time a metal. For each of your opponent's Pokemon in play, attach a metal energy from your discard pile to your Pokemon in any way that you like. So this is actually a great form of energy acceleration. Like I mentioned with Lunala, the current format is very setup heavy with people benching 4 or 5 Pokemon at a time. And so Solgaleo, definitely good. It can capitalize on that. But there are plenty of good metal attackers that discard their energy. So I think there's some inherent synergy between this and the other metal attackers currently in the game. So think about the Solgaleo GX that we already have available to us. Actually has a pretty decent attack for 3 metal, discards all of them, and does 230. Great attack, knocks out a bunch of things in the game, but a problem with that card is that sometimes it can struggle to take its last knockout to win, because at some point you usually have to retreat into like a baby Rayquaza, or at some point people were using Lurantis GX. All these different ways to restore energy to their to their Solgaleo GX. But Solgaleo Prism Star, I think, does an even better job, because if your opponent has 5 Pokemon, let's just say, in play, so what you can do is promote this guy and get almost 2 entirely powered up Solgaleo GX ready to go to clean up the game and take your last few prizes that you might need to win. So this form of energy acceleration is pretty crazy. The basic Rayquaza from Guardians Rising only accelerates 2 out of your discard to 1 of your Pokemon, but this is great because it's in any way that you like, and you can essentially accelerate up to 6 energy. So this attack is great, and especially if this thing doesn't get knocked out, you can abuse this attack multiple times throughout the course of a game. Now it does have an attack of its own as well. Corona Impact for 4 metal energy does 160, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. It's kind of an okay attack, nothing too special. With a choice band, you do hit for 190, but, more than likely you are playing this not as its own deck or anything like that. You're playing this as kind of like a support Pokemon for a different metal attacker. So most notably, it's probably going to be for Solgaleo GX, or maybe for the Dusk Mane Necrozma that we'll get to next. So I really just love this Solgaleo Prism Star. Like I said, I'm more optimistic about this than Lunala. I think Lunala has the same great attack, but doesn't have a clear-cut great partner, whereas the Solgaleo definitely has some great partners already out that could really benefit from this type of energy acceleration. And like I mentioned, we do have Dusk Mane Necrozma GX. This is going to be the new big metal type attacker that came out of Ultra Prism. So it's 190 hit point basic, so that's already a good start to it. A little above average amount of hit points for a basic GX. Fire weakness, 3 retreat cost, all things that we're kind of expecting. 3 retreat cost in particular isn't that bad because you can play things like Heavy Ball to more easily search it out. But let's look at this thing. It is an Ultra Beast, and its first attack, Claw Slash, is 3 colorless, just does a generic 60 damage. Of course, it will do 90 if you have a choice band, but overall, nothing too special. Really, its other attacks are the ones we are looking at it for. So for its main attack, Meteor Tempest, which I want to say is a really awesome attack name. For 3 metal and a colorless does 220, and you discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. So this is actually a great number to hit for. You're basically one-shotting everything that's relevant in the format. Gardevoir does have 230 hit points, but you hit it for weakness anyways, while discarding your own energy. So this is basically going to knock out everything in the format, especially if you have a choice band. There's nothing you're not knocking out if you're doing 250. So it does have kind of a steep energy cost, but like we mentioned, we do have that new Magnezone. We also have that Solgaleo Prism Star, which we just mentioned as well. So this card definitely has some ways to be powered up currently. So the high attack cost really doesn't scare me that much. And then its GX move for 3 Metal Energy has Eclipse Sun GX, 250 damage, and similarly to the Dawnwings Necrozma, you can only use this if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent. So yeah, I gotta say, I actually really like this card, and there's a couple of different directions I think players could take this. Right now, there's already the Metal Silvally type of deck that's been running around. I'm not the biggest fan of that deck personally, but you could play this in it. It has free retreat cost thanks to Silvally GX if you really wanted to go that route. But I'm not the biggest fan of that just because I'm not big on Silvally in general, but also you can't really abuse DCE outside of its first attack, which isn't that great. But the two main routes I'm considering right now are, of course, Magnezone, which we just mentioned. I think that's going to be kind of the go-to way to build this. Including us, we already have a deck that's being prepared that's going to be uploaded on the channel soon, showing off this deck in action. So that definitely seems like the go-to route to power this thing up. There's a new Stadium card in play that lets you get energy out of your discard pile. So between that and Magnezone, I think you should have no problem really getting this thing up and running every turn you want to use Meteor Tempest. But I think another less talked about way to power this thing up is actually just building this kind of like a Volcanion deck. So what I mean by that is you play, of course, your Dusk Mane Necrozmas, but you also play Registeel, Max Elixirs, and of course the new Solgaleo Prism Star that we just mentioned as well. And so instead of going the Magnezone route and playing like a stage 2 and playing the new Stadium, you just try to accelerate energy to your Dusk Mane Necrozmas with Max Elixirs and all of your Registeels. So I think that is actually a very viable way to potentially run this card that not a lot of people are talking about. Now, of course, you would probably need 1 or 2 other different attackers that don't discard their energy every time they want to attack. But nevertheless, I think this is a very solid way to go about building this style of deck. Now you can play, for example, a 1-1 Silvally line, or maybe even a 2-2 if you want to give free retreat. You also can play the new Dawnwings Necrozma GX with a Floatstone to have free retreat, since everything in your deck has a massive retreat cost. I think that's very viable as well. But this card just has so much support right now, I don't see how it would not see play. You know, you have 190 hit points, so you don't get knocked out in one hit by that many things. Gardevoir is definitely not an issue, and most of the other decks in format, other than Volcanion, take 2-hit knockouts instead of 1-hit knockouts. So the only decks that would knock you out anyways are going to be ones that hit you for weakness. So I just think there's a lot of good things going on with this card, and it's definitely, I think, for me, one of the highlights out of the set. So while we're on the subject of metal support, we also have a new dragon type that we can potentially abuse with all of this different support we've been talking about, and that is going to be Dialga GX. Of course, one of the legendaries from Diamond and Pearl. Seems fitting to make its appearance here. So Dialga GX kind of cool because it is a different type. It is weak to Fairy, which is kind of a pain, but it's nice because it gives you some additional type coverage against things like fire decks that would normally just easily one-hit you for weakness. So let's look at this thing. It has also a 3 retreat cost like a lot of these other metal attackers, so you do have access to Heavy Ball for the majority of your deck if you actually wanted to go that route. But so let's take a look. It has its first attack, clock up for a single metal energy, draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. So that's actually pretty good because this is not your ideal starter. Honestly, we are mainly looking at this card for its GX attack, but in the unfortunate situation that you do have to start with Dialga, you can use this attack to maybe play down your hand on the first turn, maybe discarding some extra supporters and getting a little bit greedy with what you're setting up with, and then use Clock Up to just refill your hand that way at the end of your turn instead. So it's a nice little consistency boosting attack and kind of makes up for maybe having unfortunate starts with this card when you really only want to be using it for its GX move. So the first attack is actually one of the big reasons I do like this card. So its next attack, Shred, for a metal and 2 colorless energy, does 80, and this attack's damage is not affected by any effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. So we've seen this attack in the past on a lot of dragon types, so that means you're going to be able to go through things like the Bandit Guard, or was it Scoundrel Guard or Bandit Guard on Hoopa? I forget. I think it's Scoundrel Guard actually. But the things that prevent damage from things like GXs or like the Alolan Ninetales that has that same ability, that means you will go through that. You'll go through things like Flash Ray on Jolteon EX. So if any of these types of wall Pokemon ever get popular again in the metagame at some point, your Dialga GX actually will have a good answer to dealing with whatever that is. But that's really not the main reason we're looking at this card. It's a half decent attack you can use in certain situations. But like I said, we were looking at it for the first attack, and more importantly, its GX move. So it has Timeless GX for 3 metal and 2 colorless. That is a big attack cost, but I think it's worth it. You're doing 150 damage, or of course 180 with a choice band ideally. And then once this turn is over, it's your turn again. You get 2 turns with this card. This is absolutely stupid. We've had, and like in the past, we've had Raichu level X, which allowed you to attack twice in the same turn. But as far as I know, we've never had a card that lets you take an additional turn. It cannot be overstated how immensely powerful the effect of this attack actually is. This is absolutely insane. Ideally, what you can do is you can actually put your opponent in a situation where you use Timeless GX to maybe knock out something like a Tapu Lele, drawing 2 prizes, and then maybe Guzma up another Lele for like your last 2 prizes of the game or something like that. So there's all sorts of crazy things you can do with this card. There's also situations where you can just take very efficient 2-hit knockouts. Like let's say you're going against like a stage 1 GX or something like that, that has like 210, 220 hit points. So a choice banded Dialga doesn't even knock it out in 1 hit anyways. You can use Timeless GX and then maybe retreat into a different attacker and finish it off or something like that. So there's all sorts of weird things you can do with this, but this effect of this attack is just absolutely insane. You know, a lot of times whenever you take a knockout, which is ideally what you're trying to do with this attack, I think you ideally want to clean up a knockout with Timeless GX, you know, taking 2 prizes and forcing your opponent to promote something else that they have to, you know, get swung on again on your next turn that you get for free. So this is absolutely insane. That's like the main use of this. There's other things too, like, you know, whenever you take these knockouts, a lot of times you have to play down your hand in anticipation of an N on your opponent's next turn. But because you don't have to worry about your opponent getting a next turn, you can like safely hang on to all of your resources, maybe to give you a chance, you know, a better chance of taking an additional knockout next turn, or, you know, setting up something else more efficiently on your next turn that you get for free. It's just so powerful. I don't know how to properly convey how good the effect of this attack actually is. It's just absolutely insane being able to play essentially 2 Sycamores before your opponent can even you know, have a turn. Is just absolutely crazy. Like, I don't know how else to say it. This effect of this attack is so insanely good. You know, the rest of this card, honestly, it's a little bit underwhelming. Like I said, you do have a nice opening attack if you are forced to start with it. But ideally, you want to power this thing up mid-game and, you know, just go to town, take 2 prizes, and get an extra turn. That's ideally what I think this deck is going to be trying to do. And it is also worth noting, too, I did mention sometimes you won't knock out things like Golisopod and things like that. But you have to remember you do have attackers like Registeel, just as an example, that can soften up some of these Stage 2 and Stage 1 GXs for you to take a knockout with Timeless GX and get that extra turn still, even after taking a knockout. I think that's really when this card is the most powerful. And like I said, when you take a knockout and then potentially have a way to take an additional knockout the next turn before your opponent even gets a chance to draw, this card is just so good, guys. Like, you know, it's definitely just a one-of. You play this literally just exclusively for the GX attack. Maybe you even play Ninja Boy, I'm not sure. But since this does require metal energy, that means you can abuse things like the Magnezone that we just mentioned. You can abuse Max Elixirs, things like that. The new Solgaleo Prism Star can easily power this thing up. So there's just so many good things to say about this. This is definitely one of my favorite GX moves that is in the game. Like I said, beyond that, the card itself is a little bit underwhelming, but because of this GX move, I would definitely imagine this card to see play. This GX move is too good not to see some play at some point, and I definitely expect it to pop up in some of these metal decks. So next up we have another dragon Pokemon that I'm actually pretty excited to talk about, and that is going to be Garchomp. So Garchomp is actually one of my favorite Pokemon just in general, not just from Gen 4, and it always consistently seems to get cool cards. And, you know, as soon as I saw that Garchomp was going to be in the set, I was ecstatic because it typically means we're going to get a half-decent Garchomp, and I think this one is no exception. This is definitely a very interesting card, and let's take a look at it. So Dragon type, which is a little bit unfortunate. I do wish this was fighting, just because fighting has much better support. You hit things like Zoroark for weakness. So I don't really like the typing that much, but I still think this card is decent enough to warrant talking about. But 150 hit points, weak to Fairy, which is kind of the downside to the Dragon typing, and no retreat cost, which is fantastic. I really love that about this card. And so its first attack, Quick Dive for a DCE, does 50 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So just like that Ice Blade attack that Alolan Ninetales has, kind of a decent little attack to soften things up, but nothing too special, I don't think. The real meat and potatoes of this card is going to be in Champion's Blade. For a fighting and DCE, does 100 damage, and if you played Cynthia from your hand during this turn, which is a new supporter, this attack does 100 more damage. And so, of course, if you have a choice band, that means you're hitting Garchomp GX for 230, which knocks out basically everything relevant that's in the current format. So this attack, definitely very, very strong. And we did cover the new Lucario recently, so Garchomp does have some support. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have Garchomp in play, Lucario can search your deck for any card, which means, of course, you can grab Cynthia to ensure that you get that 100 damage boost. But also, too, Lucario can grab you things like rare candies to start setting up additional Garchomps and things like that, or just other pieces in general to help you set up your board and, carry out your strategy the best possible. It also doesn't hurt that Cynthia is actually one of the best cards from the set. We'll talk more about it later. It's a new form of Shuffle Draw. And so it's great that Cynthia itself is actually a great card. So the fact that it requires us to play good cards to get the effects of all these attacks and abilities is a great thing for this Garchomp, Lucario like archetype that they're trying to kind of push us towards playing here. So that's definitely very, very nice. And it seems like everything's good for this card, but there are some drawbacks that I definitely have concerns over. The first thing is that it requires you to play Cynthia from your hand to get the 100 damage bonus. So that means you can't play something like a Guzma and do 230 in the same turn, which is a huge downside to this card, I have to admit. So that forces you to play kind of the suboptimal way of switching your opponent's Pokemon, like things like Counter Catcher or Pokemon Catcher, or even things like Repel if you really wanted to do something like that, or Escape Rope. So it forces you to play these other ways to switch your opponent's active Pokemon, which, that's kind of a pain, not being able to play the supporter you want to. Not being able to do 200 damage to the Pokemon that you want to. Kind of annoying, but luckily in most cases this attack is good and it's going to knock out things in one hit anyways. So you'll probably still take a knockout and get some prizes, even if it's not on something you ideally want to. But nevertheless, that's still, I think, a huge drawback to this card. And the other thing is it requires 2 energy attachments. So like I mentioned earlier with Empoleon, Empoleon has kind of a solid attack, but if your only Empoleon gets knocked out, you're in kind of a bad spot because you don't really have a way to power up a Garchomp again in one turn. But unlike Empoleon, Garchomp does not have a way to actually get a fresh one powered up in one turn again. So Empoleon has Aqua Patch, Dragon Pokemon and Garchomp have no support whatsoever to make something like that happen. So that is, I think, another huge downside to this card. If your opponent knocks out your only one, you're going to be in kind of a bad spot. Granted, we do have the Garchomp from Breakpoint, which I feel like you would probably have to play in this deck, that will allow you to accelerate energy from your discard pile, including special energy, so that means you can even get double colorless energies back, which is great. But it just forces you to make some awkward plays, and that's like the big downside to this Garchomp deck. If this attack was just a single DCE, I would say guaranteed this card will see played, but because it takes 2 energy attachments, I honestly think that might be really what makes this card not quite good enough. And that hurts me to say because I really actually do like this card. I like Garchomp. I like the entire archetype that they're giving us. It seems like a lot of fun. It's definitely my playstyle personally. But as far as like winning tournaments and winning a regional or something like that, I'm just a bit skeptical about needing the 2 energy attachments with no additional form of energy acceleration and, not being able to play Guzma and Cynthia in the same turn. So these things are definitely pretty big drawbacks for the card. And, maybe I'm being too pessimistic. I'm going to say wait and see on Garchomp. I really do like it, but I'm just a little worried it's not quite good enough to win a major tournament. But nevertheless, we are still definitely going to try this card out on the channel. We're going to test with it, and hopefully I'll be proved wrong because I love Garchomp. And But you know, I will definitely say if you're able to pick up a place out of these, it's a card I would definitely keep my eye on, and I would not be surprised if it did actually make its way into the metagame at some point. But right now, I'm just a little concerned about a few things going on with the archetype. But it's still a very interesting card and one that could still see play. And of course, we have the other Gen 4 mascot. We have Palkia GX. And so let's take a look at this one. It's the last Dragon Pokemon we're going to talk about. It has 180 hit points, 3 retreat cost, weak to Fairy, all similar to the Dialga that we just mentioned. So let's see what makes this one special. It has Spatial Control for a Water Energy. Move any number of energy from your bench Pokemon to this Pokemon. Has Hydro Pressure for 3 colorless energy of 60, plus 20 more for every water attached to Palkia. And then it has Zero Vanish GX for 3 water and a double colorless, does 150, and your opponent shuffles all energy attached to their Pokemon in their deck. So a lot of different things going on with this card. I'm trying to think of where to start with this thing. I'll just say overall though, I am not nearly as enthusiastic about this as I am Dialga GX. So let's start with, I guess, the main thing that catches our eye. Let's look at the GX move. So similar to Dialga, it has a huge attack cost. Does kind of an okay amount of damage, 150. You need Choice Band in order to do 180, which is very important. And then your opponent shuffles all of their energy back into their deck. You know, the effect is pretty good, but really let's think about the decks that we have in the format. So really the only 2 decks in the current format that really have a lot of energy in play at a time are going to be Gardevoir GX, which Gardevoir can knock you out in 1 hit, even if they shuffle all of their energy back into their deck. They only need a single fairy energy and they can actually just knock you back out. So it really doesn't do much against Gardevoir. So let's look at Volcanion. That's probably the next biggest deck in terms of how much energy is in play. Well, guess what? Volcanion's weak to water. So you play water energy, you're probably playing other water attackers in your deck to begin with. So why even use Palkia when you could just use one of these other water attackers to be guaranteed a knockout? So why would you place in Volcanion? There are certain points in the matchup where if you can take a 1-hit knockout with Zero Vanish, that actually could be an even better way to win. But I'd argue you're still favored, even if you didn't even run Palkia. If you're running just things like Lapras, maybe other basic water attackers like that, or even maybe Glaceon or something like that, you're still favored to win that matchup regardless. So Palkia does very little, I think, really to tip that matchup in your favor. And then probably the other one that I can think of that probably has a lot of energy in play out of the decks in the current metagame. I'm not factoring in other new archetypes because we don't know how the new meta is going to shape up. But the other one I can think of is Tapu Bulu. But Tapu Bulu usually accelerates energy out of the deck anyways. So even if you shuffle all of that energy back into the deck, guess what? They can just get it right back out with Vikavolt. If you go for a knockout, like where you Guzma up Vikavolt, knock it out, and shuffle all their energy back in, that could actually be a very strong play. But just generally speaking, though, that deck outside of that one play is not going to be that negatively affected by this card. All of the other decks that are in the current format attack for usually 1 energy, usually being a double colorless, maybe 2 at max. So I don't think that this GX move is really that impactful given the current decks that are in the format. Now, however, if the format has a bit of a shift and some other decks pop up that have a lot of energy on the field at a given time, would be severely hurt by this GX move, maybe it sees some play at some point. But right now, the only decks that usually have a lot of energy in play at a time, they're decks that this GX move either is not necessary for or does little against anyways. So the GX move, I don't think we can really count on this on using this card for the GX move, despite the situational times it could be useful. So its main attack, Hydro Pressure, has to be the other attack we're looking at, just because Spatial Control is not very good. So Hydro Pressure is basically like a better version of Keldeo Secret Sword. So if you have 3 water energy on you, you're going to do 120. If you have 4, you're doing 140 with a Choice Band. That's 170, knocking out Tapu Lele's. So that is actually half decent. But the problem is Keldeo EX back in the day had a great ability. It had Rush In. It had all of this great water support. Palkia does not have the same. It does not have a great ability like Rush In. And even the half-decent water support that we have in the format is for water Pokemon. You can't play Aqua Patch to accelerate energy onto Palkia. You have to use Max Elixirs or something like Abomasnow that we mentioned earlier in this video as well. So it's kind of an awkward Pokemon to power up because of all these things. And even once you power it up, I don't even think it's that much better than the attackers that we currently have. I'd much rather just use Lapras, do 160 damage. I think that's just generally better. And you can abuse Aqua Patch with Lapras. Maybe you still play one copy of Palkia for good type coverage against things like Golisopod, but other than that, I just see the use for this card being just so narrow. And it's just crazy how good Dialga is, and then when you put this next to it, it's just like, how did they make that card so good and this one's so mediocre? So, you know, guys, maybe I'm missing something, but I just don't think Palkia is that good. I'd actually maybe say this is even the worst GX in the set. I'm just not too excited about it at all. So for that reason, I'm going to say Palkia is probably bad and might not see any play. Alright guys, so we have finally our last Rotom that we are going to talk about. I bet you guys are sick of hearing about these things, but we just have one more, and this one's actually like kind of half decent, so it is worth talking about, I guess, or half decent as far as a Rotom goes. So of course, just like all the others, it has that Rotomotor ability, attacks for free if you have 9 or more tool cards in the discard pile. So this one has the attack Spinning Spin. How creative. It does 20 to each of your opponent's Pokemon and has 0 retreat cost. So very similar to the Tapu Koko promo. Same retreat cost as well, which is one of the great things about Tapu Koko. And, you know, Tapu Koko, its attack is definitely pretty solid, and this is the same thing. So I don't see why this would be that bad. Oh, of course, there's a few other things to consider, though. You do actually have fighting resistance, which is pretty good considering how popular Buzzwole has been. So you can maybe use this attack to maybe soften up some of your opponent's Pokemon to set up some knockouts with. It really just depends, though. It depends on how much damage is needed to knock out Pokemon that are popular in the current format, and how the other Rotoms that you have available to you can do that. So for example, if you know maybe some cards in the current format aren't quite easily knocked out by some of the Rotoms that you're also playing as like your main attackers, maybe you play Fan Rotom to set up some of those knockouts. However, if the damage from Spinning Spin doesn't really make much of a difference in terms of changing 3-hit knockouts to 2-hit knockouts or vice versa, or anything like that, then you might not play this Rotom. Another thing to mention too is Tapu Koko is very useful because it puts on early game pressure on decks that play a lot of low HP evolving basics, and the fact that this ability requires 9 tool cards to be in play means that you might not even be able to put on that early pressure with Fan Rotom. So on turn 1, I'm going to find it a little hard to believe that you're actually going to have 9 tool cards in the discard pile. That just seems like something that might not happen. So I think that might be one thing that could hold this card back from being decent. But like I said, we're basically just talking about this in context of the entire Rotom box deck. It has a solid attack, so that's why I'm going to say keep an eye out for it, just because if this Rotom deck or Rotom box deck becomes anything at all, this is definitely a consideration. But I'm just concerned that the damage from it might not make a difference based on the amount of damage that the other Rotoms already do. And I'm also just a little concerned that it might be too hard to get 9 tool cards in the discard pile in the early game to actually abuse this attack to great effect. But nevertheless, it is kind of useful because it is a free retreater, so you'll always have a great Pokemon to promote whenever you play things like Guzma. And that you could also potentially fall back on as a backup attacker to maybe set up some knockouts with. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it. Like I said, this thing is only as good as the Rotom box deck itself. So, like I said, keep an eye out for it. It might be like a one-of in that type of deck, but I wouldn't imagine any copies of this card higher than that, though. Alright guys, we have the very last Pokemon of the set review, and it's going to be Oranguru. So this is kind of another interesting card from the set that I am still debating, what I think of it. But let's talk about it. It has 120 hit points as a basic, which is fine and dandy. 2 retreat cost, pretty expected. Fighting weakness, not the best, but you don't get one-shotted by Buzzwole, or not with Jet Punch at least. So that is kind of good, I suppose. And the reason we are looking at this card is for its first attack, Resource Management. For just a single colorless energy, put 3 cards from your discard pile on the bottom of your deck in any order that you would like. So this is actually a pretty powerful form of recovery. Being able to get any resources whatsoever. So take something like Sableye that we have in expanded format, has seen heavy play because it lets you get 2 item cards back into your hand. And that's just item cards, so you're very limited on the types of cards you can actually get back. So Oranguru actually lets you get 3 of any type of card, but the downside is they do go on the bottom of your deck instead of actually just going straight to your hand, which to be fair does make a big difference. But there is a supporter card, which we will talk about soon, that actually lets you draw cards from the bottom of your deck. So that is kind of the synergy, and the kind of the idea that they are going for. They want you to play a lot of these cards that this new supporter that lets you draw from the bottom of your deck, and you play a Oranguru as a way of getting resources, back kind of easily that way. So basically, if you're playing this new supporter card, which we'll talk about soon, called Looker, if you're already playing that in a deck, you would definitely play a Oranguru. But honestly, outside of this Oranguru card, this new Looker card just is not the best supporter. So I don't think players will just be playing copies of Looker just because. I feel like the entire deck would be based around Oranguru and Looker. So my initial idea, if this card is going to be played, is going to be some sort of mill or control deck. So the idea is that you would play things like Crushing Hammers and Delinquents, or Team Flare Grunts, all these disruptive cards, and then at the end of your turn you'd play Resource Management to put them back into your deck. So ideally you're going to be very item reliant on your disruption, because every turn you want to ideally use a Looker to get these resources back. So you're not going to be able to play things like Team Flare as much. So you're going to be much more reliant on things like Crushing Hammer, Enhanced Hammer, maybe Counter Catcher, because ideally you're trying to mill your opponent, and basically it's a big control deck. That's the only thing I can really think of with this card. Maybe there's something that I am missing, but that is the only real way I can see this Oranguru being played. And like I said, Sableye Garb in the past has been a very good deck. And expanded. So maybe in standard format, this is our version of it. We play a Oranguru maybe with like a 2/2 Garbodor or something like that, or maybe even like a 3/3 if you want to play Trashlange as well. And it is a basic energy, so that means you can have all sorts of different partners for Oranguru if you choose to. I don't know. I kind of like the card. It's very interesting. The fact that you get any 3 cards is so powerful. So being able to get back things like Puzzles of Time is very, very powerful. Getting back Crushing Hammers. These are cards that you want unlimited copies of because they are so good. And so because of that, I'm going to say keep an eye out on Oranguru. It's definitely interesting, but I'm just struggling to really see a really broken deck with it. But like I said, if I was going to sit down and build a deck, my initial strategy would be to build a control deck similar to Sableye Garb, but for the standard format, revolving around this Oranguru card. So for that reason, I kind of like the card, but I'm too afraid to commit to saying it's good. So I'm going to say keep an eye out for it. I would definitely pick up a few copies just because this attack is so good. Resource Management, getting 3 of any type of cards back into your deck. That's just very, very powerful. So like I said, keep an eye out for it. I'm not sure how well it's going to do, but I would not be surprised if someone found a way to break this Oranguru Looker type of deck. But we'll talk more about that supporter later. But like I said, for Oranguru, seems like an okay card. Keep an eye out for it. Alright guys, so moving on to the trainer cards from the set. The first one we're going to talk about is going to be Mysterious Fossil. So it looks like Pokemon is kind of retooling the fossil mechanic. The previous one where you looked at cards from the bottom of your deck and things like that, just it was very inconsistent, and usually the only ways people were getting fossils into play was through things like Maxie's Hidden Ball Trick and other ways to kind of get around the regular fossil mechanic because it was just so hard to actually make use of. So looks like they're going back to the old Mysterious Fossil mechanic. So it's an item card. You play this card as if it were a 60 HP basic colorless Pokemon. At any time during your turn before you attack, you may discard this card from play. This card can't retreat. So basically now all of the fossils will evolve from this one Mysterious Fossil card, which is kind of interesting because you can play, for example, starting with Mysterious Fossil, you can play a Bastiodon and a Rampardos all evolving from the same Mysterious Fossil line, which is kind of a double-edged sword, but also kind of neat at the same time. There are definitely some ruling questions I have regarding this card. So in the past, Mysterious Fossil did not give up a prize, if I remember correctly, if it was knocked out. But this card does not actually specify if your opponent gets a prize when they knock it out. But I am going to assume it does because we had Robo Substitute from Phantom Forces, which specifically stated your opponent did not draw a prize when they knock it out. So since Mysterious Fossil does not actually specify that, I'm going to assume your opponent does still draw a prize as normal. But I will assume that whenever you discard this card from play, it does not count as a knockout. So that is the one nice part about it, though. So overall, though, I really like this new fossil mechanic that they have. Well, I shouldn't really call it new because it's more like the old one than a new one from scratch. But I definitely am looking forward to actually being able to use fossil cards again, just because a lot of times these fossil Pokemon aren't half bad, but they are just like near impossible to consistently get into play, which has basically limited them to really not seeing any success at any tournament. So I'm really happy that we have Mysterious Fossil back, but this card is really only as good as the quality of fossil Pokemon available to us. But nevertheless, definitely keep an eye out for it, and definitely be on the lookout for new fossil Pokemon as they are printed. And you never know, Mysterious Fossil might see some play. So the next card on our list to talk about is going to be Palpad. This is actually a reprint, one of many actually in this set. And just for clarification too, there's actually a ton of trainer reprints in this set, but I'm choosing not to talk about any of them that aren't already in the current format. We have things like Fan Club and Nest Ball and Pokemon Catcher that were released in Japan's set, but we already have these things in the current format, so I'm not going to talk about those. Only reprints that aren't currently in the current standard format. So Palpad is one of those cards. It was a card back from Flash Fire, and it does the same thing now as it does then. So shuffle 2 supporter cards from your discard pile back into your deck. So we now actually have a half decent form of support recovery. This is not going to be Versus Seeker, where people play 4 of it in every deck or anything like that, but Palpad back in the day did see some play in certain decks. Not every deck played it, but a lot did. They played maybe like a 1 copy of, just to be able to ensure that they could get a couple supporters back when they needed them. So what I'm thinking about right now is there's not going to be too many decks that really benefit from this at the time of filming. If your deck is your typical deck that plays 4 Sycamore, 4 N, 2 Bridget, and 3 Guzma, honestly, I don't think there's a big need for Palpad, but the decks that I'm thinking about that could make better use of this are the ones that play kind of like some tech supporters, like maybe the 1 count of Acerola, or like a 1 copy of Flare Grunt, or things like that. Those are the decks I am more considering when I'm thinking about Palpad, being able to reuse those tech supporters, because they're not cards that you want to run thick counts of in your deck, but you also want to be able to have access to them, and you want to be able to use them even if you have to discard them early on with a Sycamore or something like that. So I think Palpad definitely helps in these types of decks. Another one that we get out of this new Ultra Prism set is Garchomp. So Palpad will allow you to reuse Cynthia's and get those back into your deck. That way your Garchomps can keep doing the maximum amount of damage. So Palpad, it's definitely a card I'm happy to see come back. It's not like a super broken card or anything, but with the current options for retrieving supporters being limited to things like Elusamine and Puzzle of Time, Puzzle being slightly inconsistent and Lusamine being very slow, Palpad kind of offers a decent solution for most decks to use. So for that reason, I'm going to say it's a good card. You probably won't see it as more than a one of index, but nevertheless, I think it'll still see some play, and happy to have it back in the game. And speaking of inconsistent cards like Puzzle of Time, we have something kind of similar, but much worse. We have Missing Clover. So that's another new item card. You may play 1 Missing Clover or 4 Missing Clover at the same time, similar to Puzzle of Time. You get 2 different effects depending on how many you play. If you play 1 Missing Clover, look at the top card of your deck, then return it to the top of your deck. If you play 4 Missing Clover at the same time, take a prize card. You can only use this effect once for the 4 cards. So this is pretty terrible, guys. I hate to say it. Like, yes, the effect of just getting an instant prize off an item card is pretty good, but anyone who's ever played Puzzle of Time knows how difficult it can be to actually get 2 Puzzles of Time in your hand at the same time. You have to get 4 of these in your hand at the same time. If you're playing something like Metagross, yes, you could potentially use Algorithm GX and search out all 4 right out of your deck, or similarly for Sylveon, you can use Magical Ribbon to grab 3 of them. But just generally speaking, I don't see it. Even those decks, I have no interest in playing this card in. So in Sylveon, Puzzle of Time is great because you can get back resources like Crushing Hammers and ways to mill your opponent. In the case of Metagross, Algorithm is great because it allows you to grab rare candies and the things that you need to actually set up your board to win the entire game, not just take a free prize card that doesn't affect your opponent's board in any way. So I've got to say, guys, this card is absolutely terrible. Even the effect of just playing one card, look at the top card of your deck, that's nothing good at all. At least Puzzle of Time lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and rearrange them. That is at least a decent effect on its own if you have to play it for that effect. But Missing Clover, guys, this card is so bad. This is like, it's not as bad as Greedy Dice that came out back in like Steam Siege, which we absolutely tore apart here on the channel. So this is a step above that, but not a big one. So unfortunately, guys, I would not expect to ever see this card, see competitive play. Maybe you can play around with it on PTCGO and have some fun, but I would never expect to see this card at a competitive event doing well. So unfortunately, guys, I gotta say this card is pretty terrible. So next up we have another new item card called Order Pad. So you flip a coin, if heads, search your deck for an item card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So it's supposed to be kind of like a little bit of a consistency booster, and at first glance, this card's like not that bad. I mean, if you play it for its effect, you can grab things like rare candies to, finish evolving. You can play Ultra Balls, all sorts of stuff like that. But it's a flip, and I hate to say that. We've had other solid flip cards in the past, like Crushing Hammer, which has seen a decent amount of play. But for this, I'm trying to think what deck really wants to play this card. And for me, the big one that I could see from a way of searching out item cards would be maybe Stage 2 decks that are trying to get rare candies to evolve into their Pokemon. And the problem I have with this is that Stage 2 decks are inherently inconsistent to begin with, so you're playing an item card to boost your consistency, but yet that item card itself is inconsistent at actually helping your deck. So that's why I just don't see a big use for Order Pad. I will say this though, if you are playing a fossil deck, I think Order Pad is a consideration because this actually allows you a way to search out Mysterious Fossil from your deck and get it into play, since Bridget and Pokemon Fan Club and Ultra Ball and things like that won't actually work on it. So if you are playing a fossil deck, like I said, I would probably play this card just because you have no other better option. But just in general though, I just don't see this card being very good. Even once fossils get some better support, I would definitely imagine this card would quickly fall off once better things get printed. But right now, I see this being an absolute last resort for fossil decks and just not even a consideration for any other deck. If this was maybe flip a coin, if I'd search your deck for a trainer card, I would actually be a little bit more enthusiastic about this because, if we have a dead hand or something like that, you could at least maybe try to flip and get a supporter to grab like a Guzma for, to take a knockout, or a Sycamore to get a new hand or something like that. But because it's specifically for an item card, I just don't think the risk is worth the reward in this case. It's just too situational, I think, and doesn't really benefit the decks that need it the most. Like, again, in the case of Stage 2 decks, I think those are going to be the main ones that really want to use this card. But like I said, this doesn't really, it's an inconsistent way of making inconsistent decks more consistent. I hope that makes sense. So like I said, I'd probably play this in fossil decks just because there's no other options. But beyond that, I think this is kind of a bad card, and it might see play. I could be wrong, but right now I don't really care for this card, I hate to say. So unfortunately, I'm going to pass on this one. Alright guys, so we are not done talking about bad trainer cards just yet. We have yet another one. We have a Skateboard. So this is a new tool card, and the retreat cost of the Pokemon this tool is attached to is 1 less, and that Pokemon may retreat while asleep or paralyzed. So this is a very underwhelming effect, I hate to say. So being able to retreat while asleep or paralyzed is nice, but guess what? We have Switch already in the format and Escape Rope. These are already cards that do the same thing, and the retreat of 1 less really isn't a big deal. Decks that have 1 retreat cost already don't really mind paying the 1 to retreat just because it's a pretty manageable retreat cost, and decks that have more than a 1 retreat cost want to play Floatstone because it's very awkward to retreat those 2 and 3 retreat Pokemon. So Skateboard is just really kind of in an awkward spot. Yes, you can retreat while asleep or paralyzed, but like I said, we already have Switch and Escape Rope. They are much better at doing the things that this card is kind of being like marketed towards, I guess, for lack of a better term. You can get out of status conditions, any kind of status condition, and you can get out of the active spot without paying any retreat cost. However, though, if this card had said the retreat cost is 2 less, I would be much more excited about this card because this would actually outclass Floatstone in certain decks. Decks that only have one retreating Pokemon don't really play cards like Floatstone to begin with, so this card doesn't really make much sense in those situations. Anyway, so like I said, if it was 2 less, a Skateboard would actually be, I think, a great card and would see play. But the fact that it's only 1 less actually just really kills, I think, any chance of this card being that viable. Now, you never know, there might be some sort of status condition heavy deck that might emerge in the future that this could be useful for. But again, I would just argue that Switch and Escape Rope are better cards to accomplish what this card is trying to do. So unfortunately, I have to say this card is bad. It just barely misses the mark of being a good card, and it's just outclassed by other things that are currently in the format. So next up, we have Looker's Whistle. This is another item card. Search your deck for up to 2 Looker cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually kind of interesting because we have that Looker card that has synergy with Oranguru. And so now you have kind of an engine set up. You have Oranguru to get back resources. You have Looker's Whistle to get Lookers out of your deck. And you have Looker to get this card you put from the bottom of your card or bottom of your deck back into your hand. So you have kind of like this little engine for this Oranguru style deck if you're going to go that route. And it seems interesting. You also have Pal Pad to get back your Lookers if need be, so you could potentially Pal Pad some Lookers back into your deck and then use Looker's Whistle to get them back into your hand. And one reason I actually really like that it puts 2 Looker cards into your hand is because what that means is whenever you would play a deck that play a card that searches your deck, that's going to shuffle your deck, and if you're playing a Oranguru, you won't be able to draw those cards you put back from your deck or back into your deck from the bottom anymore. So the fact that you basically have 2 turns where you can be for sure guaranteed to draw from the bottom exactly what you want is actually pretty good. So, I kind of like this card, but it's really only as good as the Looker card is. The actual Looker card itself seems okay. So I just think this entire engine is really only good as the decks that can use it. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it. There might be some weird Oranguru deck, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that could potentially make use of this whole engine. So I'm going to say wait and see. I'm not like super sold on it, but I think it has potential. So moving on to our supporters, I think the first one we should probably cover is Looker, since we just mentioned Looker's Whistle, and it is the supporter that lets you draw 3 cards from the bottom of your deck. So like I've mentioned before, it has synergy with that Oranguru and Looker's Whistle. It's kind of this new engine they've kind of set up for us to use here. And I've kind of said everything I think there is to say about all these cards at this point. It's drawing 3 cards isn't great. Being able to draw exactly the 3 cards you want with Oranguru is much better though. So I think this card has much more potential than something like a Cherrim or a Tierno or a How or something like that, since you're guaranteed to get exactly what you want. But, it's still just drawing 3 cards, which is not the best form of draw power, especially when things like Sycamore, N, and the new Cynthia exist. So like I said, I think this card is really only as good as this whole Oranguru Looker style deck that might emerge. So for that reason, I'm going to say keep an eye out for it. It might do something, but it also might not. I think it's kind of up in the air, but I'm going to say keep an eye out on it. Who knows? Maybe something cool will come of it. Alrighty guys, so I don't know about you, but I am sick of talking about mediocre trainer cards, and so on that note, we have a great one to talk about. We have Cynthia. So I can't express to you how excited I actually am about this card finally being printed. So if you followed our channel for a while, every time there's been a new draw supporter being printed in these sets that's like kind of mediocre, me and Marcus immediately tear it apart, and we've said, why don't they just reprint Professor Oak's new theory? It's what the community wants. They keep trying to like dance around reprinting it and trying to give us these other weird shuffle draw supporters, but they finally caved in, I guess, and we have Cynthia. So shuffle your hand into your deck, draw 6 cards. So you might be thinking, well, Shauna did the same thing as this, only for 1 less. Is that a big deal? And yes, I would say it is a big deal, because now a lot of people play N just for a way to easily shuffle their hand into their deck and draw 6 in the early game just to, set up and all that type of stuff. And Cynthia does that without refreshing your opponent's hand for them. And so again, if you haven't been playing the game for a while, you might be thinking, is that really that good? Are people going to play this? And the answer is a resounding yes. So the last time N Sycamore, or at the time Professor Juniper, and Professor Oak's new theory, which does the same thing as Cynthia, all existed in the same format. Basically, every deck ran some combination of all 3 supporters, depending on the deck. Typically all basic decks would run a, maxed count of Sycamore, since they don't really have a lot of moving pieces like Rare Candy and Evolutions to discard. And Evolution decks typically relied on a higher count of Professor Oak's new theory and N, as opposed to Sycamore. So now Cynthia finally gives us another way to build our supporter lines, and I'm really excited because every deck basically has had the same supporter line for a while. 4 Sycamore, 4 N, 3 Guzma, 2 Bridget, or something kind of close to that. But now Cynthia, like I said, it gives a lot of decks much more flexibility, and a lot of these decks that have a lot of evolutions and stuff like that that don't really want to play Sycamore, but they have to because it's all that we really have, can finally play a different supporter. So take something like Greninja Break. You're essentially playing a stage 3, and a lot of times Sycamore just really hurts you. You have so many moving pieces in your deck. There's not a whole lot of times you can really play your hand down to 0 to play Sycamore. So Cynthia is amazing in something like Greninja, or really any evolution deck that has multiple evolution pieces. Cynthia is just so good. Of course it's good in Garchomp, which we've mentioned. It relies on Cynthia to do damage. But just in general, evolution decks, I think in particular, are going to love Cynthia. And so one thing I've always been annoyed with too, with N, is it's more of a disruption card. This is not supposed to be a card that you are playing to just refresh your hand. It's meant to punish your opponent in the late game for, being ahead, while also, helping you get set up while you're like coming back from behind. It's not really supposed to be this early game draw supporter. It's not really just what it's meant to be. Cynthia finally fills that role for us, and we're not going to have to rely on N to do that anymore. So I'm just absolutely ecstatic that Cynthia is back. This is one of the best cards we've had printed in a long time, and right now we don't have anything like Sycamore being reprinted, so that means after rotation happens at the end of the season, if there's not a reprint of it, then we're not going to have any other good draw options. So it was imperative that they finally printed a good draw supporter for us to have next season, if N and Sycamore don't see any sort of reprint at some point. So yeah, guys, there's not too much else I can really say about this card. It's a pretty straightforward card, but definitely this card will see play. Guarantee. Get yourself a play set. Definitely one of my favorite cards from the set by far. And one thing I think is interesting to note, in Japan, this card is actually a rare holo. So you don't see that too much with trainer cards. Our last one, I believe, was Getsus, all the way back from, was it Plasma Freeze at this point? So, or maybe it was Plasma Storm. I forget, but from one of the Plasma sets, basically. I think it's just really interesting that this is going to be a holo, so maybe the price will be a little bit higher on these. We'll have to see, but who knows? They might just make it a non-holo when they bring it to the international release. Who knows? But I just thought that was an interesting thing to note too. So up next we have yet another, I'd say, half-decent supporter. We have Volkner. So search your deck for an item card and a lightning energy, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually kind of an interesting card. At first glance, to me, it kind of falls somewhere in between Steven and Karina in terms of how playable it is. Karina definitely saw play in a ton of decks, and this is very similar, but instead of grabbing a Pokemon, you're grabbing an energy card. So I don't think that is as strong, but there are definitely decks that I think could benefit from this. So something like a Magnezone deck could potentially make use of this, where they can grab themselves a rare candy or an Ultra Ball to evolve into Magnezone, and then at least one lightning energy to be able to get in play for the turn. So that's interesting. Also potentially could play it with Raichu to maybe grab, maybe a Floatstone, or, a Max Elixir or Choice Band, or, whatever it might be, and get another energy and play that turn. So it seems kind of interesting. I don't really see a great immediate use for it. There's no deck that, when I saw this card, I was just like, dying to put it in. But nevertheless, like I said, it's better than Steven, which saw play in certain decks like Primal Groudon and Quad Lapras, just as an example. So this is better than that. So I would imagine at some point this card will see play, but I'm just going to say keep an eye out for it, because at the time of filming, I don't really see anything that is really just dying to play this card. So That's why I'm not going to be too optimistic about it, but I I feel like at some point this card will be playable. Just right now, I'm just not seeing what deck it might be, but I would imagine one in the future will pop up. So next up, we have a pretty interesting supporter. We have Super Saiyan Blue Go. Oh, we got Cyrus. My bad, my bad. So we have our first Prism Star supporter, which is interesting. So supporters, or trainer cards and energy will be able to have their own Prism Star cards, which kind of make things a little interesting. Kind of like the old Ace specs where you had things like computer search as a one of index and things like that. So let's take a look at Cyrus and see what it's all about. So as usual, just like with the Pokemon Prism Star cards, you can only have one of these in your deck, and if it's discarded, put it in the Lost Zone instead. So this card can only be used if your active Pokemon is Water or Metal, but then your opponent chooses two of their bench Pokemon, then they shuffle their other bench Pokemon and all cards attached to them into their deck. So this is like a parallel city, like kind of on steroids almost. Like this is a crazy effect for a supporter to have. So especially if you're playing against a deck, maybe let's say like Volcanion, that typically has a bunch of Pokemon with a lot of energy in play, you can force them to put a bunch of their Pokemon just back into their deck, crippling their board state. Similarly, for other decks that play a lot of Pokemon, like maybe Decidueye GX or Zoroark GX, things like that, these great support Pokemon that typically sit on your bench, you're going to basically force your opponent to decide, you want to put back your attackers into your deck, or are you going to put your support Pokemon that you rely on to carry out your strategy back into your deck as well. So this card's effect is definitely very, very good. The only downside is very specific. So that means things like water and metal Pokemon are going to be the only ones who will make use of this, which is kind of annoying. And honestly, I think that really limits the use of Cyrus, unfortunately. I don't really see too many decks off the top of my head that really, really want to play this card. I can maybe see metal decks playing this because in the case of Volcanion, they typically have a ton of different Pokemon in play with energy. And so playing this in metal decks could give them an edge to potentially have a chance against fire. So I think that is an option. But other than that, I'm not seeing a great immediate use for this card, unfortunately. I guess maybe if you're playing a deck with Tapu Fini GX, you could play Cyrus and then use Tapu Storm GX to shuffle an additional Pokemon back into their deck. That would be actually kind of impressive. So maybe you could consider this as a one of Greninja or something. Maybe it's a stretch. So I really enjoy the effect of this card. It's a very, very powerful effect for a supporter card. But again, my problem is that it's very specific to water and metal types. And so that is something that's a bit of a problem. But one thing I will say, this could potentially have some use in Silvally GX at some point in the future. They are printing more of those memory cards to give Silvally an additional type. So you could very well play down a water or metal memory at some point if they print those and make use of Cyrus. I do think that is an option. But, like I said, just generally speaking though, guys, I'm not really sold on this card just yet. Like I said, I think the effect is so strong, I would not be surprised if someone played it in a deck at some point. But right now, I just don't see its immediate use, and that's my big problem with this. And honestly, it's probably for the best. If you could use this card with any Pokemon regardless of type, you're basically just setting up your opponent to use Sylveon GX to play Cyrus, and then just play GX your remaining bench Pokemon back into your hand. It would be absolutely crippling if they allowed you to use this with any Pokemon. So it's probably smart that they did limit the typing a bit. But because of it, like I said, I'm going to say just keep an eye out for it. I don't think it has a great, blatant, immediate use, but I would not be surprised if this card did catch on eventually. So the next supporter we're going to talk about is Gardenia. So you get to heal 80 damage from one of your Pokemon with any grass energy attached to it. Kind of interesting, pretty straightforward, nothing too special going on here. We've had supporters like this in the past with things like Pokemon Center Lady, which has seen play. But to be fair, Pokemon Center Lady is actually pretty good because it's not limited to one type. It does heal 20 less damage, but you also do get to heal status conditions, which can be useful as well. So Gardenia, its uses are definitely much more limited, but for the Pokemon that can abuse it, it is definitely, I think, a little bit better than Pokemon Center Lady was. So the most immediate one that comes to mind for me is going to be Leafeon GX, which we mentioned earlier in the set review. So Leafeon's ability allows it to tank hits and heal damage from it, but then you also have Gardenia you could potentially play to heal an additional 80 damage, basically healing 130 for the turn, which is crazy. You can, between its normal self-healing ability that it has and Gardenia, you can really prevent your opponent from taking knockouts and force them to maybe like 3 or 4 hit knock you out, depending on how much damage they attack for. You also have things like Glaceon GX, which you could use to heal it, but I think generally speaking, Glaceon just prefers Acerola and things like that over this because you need to get Glaceon out of the active spot every single turn, and Acerola not only does that, but basically heals it at the same time. So unfortunately, I don't see this card being that useful there, but right now I think Leafeon is the main one. I don't really see too many other examples where I would really love to play this card. Another consideration though, we do have some new special energies that we're going to be talking about in this set that could allow some use for Gardenia. Gardenia does not specify basic grass energy, so that means decks that play Rainbow Energy or the new Unit Energy could make use of this effect as well. So one potential thing you could do is if you play the new Unit Energy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, with Glaceon and Decidueye, like we mentioned earlier in the video, you could actually use Gardenia to tank with your Glaceons and ensure that they don't get knocked out. So that is definitely a potential option. But like I said, there's not too many great immediate uses I see for this. I think Leafeon is going to be the big one. I'm not sure if you have space for it in Leafeon or not based on some of the lists I have been messing with, but I definitely think that seems like the main one, and definitely I think a card to keep an eye out on. As new cards get added to the card pool, I think the effect of this supporter is pretty good. It's going to turn your opponent's 2-hit knockouts into 3-hit knockouts in a lot of cases, so I would not be surprised if this did pop up in decks at some point, similar to how Pokemon Center Lady did. So for that reason, I'm going to be a little bit optimistic and say keep an eye out for it. This card could pop up at some point. And the last new supporter card we're going to talk about is going to be Mars. So Mars, you get to draw 2 cards, then discard a random card from your opponent's hand. So this is actually kind of like a spiritual successor to Team Rocket's Trickery back from the Heart Gold era. Basically did the same thing, draw 2 cards, but that card, your opponent, I believe, did choose the card they discarded. It looks like with this one, you get to choose at random. So that is, I guess, inherently a little bit better. But that card really didn't see too much play back in the day, and I don't think the slight change in the additional effect of the card is going to be enough to really change that with Mars either. So drawing 2 cards is just not that good. Zoroark GX sees a lot of play because you get to draw 2 cards while thinning out useless cards from your hand and deck. Also, you get to draw cards while it not being a supporter. You're still free to play things like Guzma and Sycamore on top of using your trade ability. So just drawing 2 cards as a supporter is just very underwhelming, especially when things like Professor Sycamore exist or even things like Howl. So that begs the question, what decks would really want to benefit from discarding cards from your opponent's hand? And for me, the only ones that I would really struggle to think of are going to be mill-style decks like Sylveon. Like decks where you want to draw some cards to maybe get like a Crushing Hammer or, some more disruption cards, but you also want to disrupt your opponent a little bit. You'd want to play something like a Delinquent, but you still need to draw some other stuff for the turn. So Mars might be a nice compromise in those types of decks. But again, that's really the only thing I can really think of off the top of my head. So because of that, I just don't see, where this is really going to fit in. When you also look at something like Cynthia that we just got printed in this set, where you get a fresh hand of 6, you have to ask yourself, why would you ever want to play this over what we already have in the format? There's other cards like Lily as an example that are half decent supporters that don't even see much play. So Mars, I definitely don't expect to see play when there are cards that are objectively better than this that don't even make their way into any competitive deck. So for that reason, unfortunately guys, I think Mars is kind of bad. Like I said, who knows, maybe some sort of mill deck might play it at some point. But beyond that, I really don't see any purpose for this card, and I do not expect it to see any competitive play. And the only stadium card we have in the set is going to be Mount Coronet. So this is going to be the last trainer card we're going to take a look at, and we're going to end things on a pretty decent note for our trainer cards, hopefully. So once during each player's turn, that player may put 2 metal energy from their discard pile into their hand. So that's actually kind of decent when you look at the metal support that we have in the game. So whenever you discard your energy with something like a Dusk Mane Necrozma GX, And if you play Magnezone, you can use Mount Coronet, get those energy back into your hand, and immediately throw them back down with Magnezone. So that definitely seems like the way to go here. It's basically like a built-in energy retrieval that you can make use of at least once. Energy retrieval, you get one guaranteed use out of. Mount Coronet, you can potentially get more uses out of. And instead of having to maybe sycamore away things like energy retrievals early on, Mount Coronet's better because you can put it in play and basically keep it there until you need it. So Mount Coronet definitely seems like a strict improvement over energy retrieval in like metal style decks that are going to use Magnezone. And that's really the only use I could see this. I did mention earlier, if you play some sort of deck around Dusk Mane Necrozma with things like metal energies and max elixirs and stuff like that, that's a potential way to play that deck. But I don't think this really helps that style of deck, just because getting the two energies back into your hand doesn't make a big difference since you can't play both of them down at the same time. So Mount Coronet, I think, exclusively has use probably in the Magnezone variant of whatever metal archetype may emerge from this set. It is worth noting, if you play Zoroark GX as well, in whatever deck that we're talking about, you can discard your metal energy and get it back with Mount Coronet. So I think that's a potential combo you could consider if you're thinking about support Pokemon like Octillery or Magnezone in whatever metal style deck you're trying to play. So Mount Coronet, I kind of like this card, but I think it's really only as good as the quality of this Magnezone style deck I've been mentioning throughout this set review. So for that reason, it seems like an okay card, and I'd maybe expect to see it see play if Magnezone sees play. But outside of that, I don't see too many uses for this card. So as we mentioned a couple times throughout this review, we do have some new special energies that we're going to cover, and the first two that we're going to look at are going to be the new unit energy cards. It's kind of a reprint of the old blend energies, but slightly weaker because they only provide 3 different types of energy as opposed to 4. So there's 2 different ones. Currently there's one that provides water, fire, and grass Pokemon, or I'm sorry, water, fire, and grass energy, or just a colorless energy if it's attached to a Pokemon that's not those types. There's another one that provides metal, lightning, and psychic, or again, colorless energy if it's not attached to one of those types of Pokemon. So these energies are kind of cool because if you're playing a deck that would normally play Rainbow Energy, you could potentially replace them with these and not have to take that pesky damage counter that Rainbow Energy normally requires you to take. So in the past, certain Golisopod GX variants have ran a copy of Tapu Fini GX just for that Tapu Storm GX move. And so if that type of deck was still around, they could potentially play this unit energy instead of the rainbow energy, just to prevent themselves from taking that extra damage whenever they get the rainbow in play. So that's an option. Also too, I did mention the potential idea to use unit energy in like a Glaceon Decidueye type of deck. So that's also an option. We also mentioned the Luxray Garbodor style deck. So you could play the one that provides a lightning and psychic energy if you wanted to go that route, giving yourself the option to use an attack from Luxray if you had to do so. So I think these energies are kind of interesting. I think at first glance they're kind of mediocre because I don't see a whole lot of amazing uses for them, but I would not be surprised if at some point there is a deck that makes use of them. Blend Energy saw play whenever they had come out, so I don't see any reason why these wouldn't either, just because being able to save yourself a damage counter from Rainbow Energy is pretty good, I think. So for that reason, I think these cards are pretty decent, and I would expect them to see play at some point as well. And it's worth noting, we don't have an energy that provides Fairy, Dark, and Fighting. So I'm assuming maybe in Japan's SM5 Plus set, or maybe their just proper SM6 set, will probably have that one get printed as well. So just want to point that out. We don't have one for those types just yet, but I would be willing to bet on it that they are coming at some point too. And so the last card of the set review, we have Super Boost Energy Prism Star. So like I said, Prism Stars are not limited to Pokemon. They are on trainer cards and energy as well. And of course, like I've mentioned several times, the rule does not change. These still go to the Lost Zone whenever they get discarded, and you can only play one of these in your deck. So Super Boost Energy Prism Star provides a colorless energy, but while it's attached to a Stage 2 Pokemon, it provides every type of energy. But if it's attached to a Stage 2 Pokemon and you have 3 or more Stage 2s in play, this card provides 4 of every energy at the same time. This is quite an obnoxious card, I hate to say. Being able to provide essentially a rainbow energy without the damage counter is good for stage 2 Pokemon, but there's not too many decks where I really see a use for this. I think the main effect anyone would ever consider this card for is going to be for the second effect, where if you have 3 or more stage 2 Pokemon in play, it provides 4 energy of every type. So that means if you have 3 Gardevoir GX in play and you slap this thing down, you get a free 120 damage to add to the field. So that is super crazy. Who knows, maybe this card will allow Gardevoir to stick around even while all these metal Pokemon are coming out. One thing that is important to note, this is a special energy, and there has been a lot of special energy hate lately, so you might not even get much use out of Super Boost energy. But nevertheless, if you can make use of the second effect that this thing provides and get all 4 energy and play at a time, that is absolutely crazy and can allow some really wild plays to occur. But the only thing is, getting 3 stage 2s in play can prove to be very challenging. Even in Gardevoir decks, I find myself maybe only having 2 in play at a time. 3 is very, very rare, I think. Especially depending on the matchup too. So I'm really not sure how I feel about this. Metagross could be a potential option. Metagross has been known to be able to get 3 Metagross in play at a time, so this could be a potential option in that deck as well, maybe. Also, potentially Solgaleo GX variants, being able to just attach this thing and immediately have a Sunsteel Strike ready to go could be kind of cool. So there's a lot of interesting uses for this card, but it's very, very situational. And basically, I would only ever play this card in decks where you can consistently get out 3 or more basics, or I'm sorry, 3 or more stage 2s. So for that reason, I'm just going to say keep an eye out for this card. The effect of this card is absolutely wild, but it might just be too situational to actually make use of. But like I said, if there is a deck that comes along where it is fairly consistent at getting out 3 stage 2s, this is an automatic inclusion, I feel like, just because the effect of this is so, so good. So yeah guys, that's pretty much going to wrap up our Ultra Prism set review. I gotta say, my voice is shot from talking about all these cards. This actually, I think, might be our longest set review to date, but Ultra Prism just is a huge set and has a ton of new cards that are worth discussing here. So let's kind of go over some of my final thoughts of the set. A couple of the big things that I'm really excited about. We have some metal support, so people who have been looking for a way to more easily deal with Gardevoir GX might finally be in luck with the things like the new Dusk Mane Necrozma and the new Magmortar and things like that. We have the new evolutions. Leafeon GX looks to be a very, very fun card. I don't know how competitive it's going to be just yet, but I actually love the design of the card. I'm excited for that. Glaceon GX might even shake up the metagame even bigger than any other card in the set, just because it's going to decrease people's reliance on things like Tapu Lele GX as a form of setting up their board. So we'll have to see what happens once Glaceon finally starts making its way into the tournament scene. But not even just the GXs are good. We have several playable non-GXs, which I'm always happy to see. We have things like Empoleon in the set and Garchomp. So I'm always excited to see that, because usually the tournaments are very heavily dominated by GXs and EXs, and I like seeing good 1-prize attackers being printed as an alternative to these big 2-prize Pokemon. Just because, what's the point of printing, 150 cards in a set if only, like 6 or 7 are actually good. So happy to see that. I think that's always a sign of a good set to me. We also finally have a new form of draw support, so you will finally quit hearing me complain about how they won't reprint Professor Oak's new theory anymore. We finally have Cynthia. That's going to be the big one. I think Looker is also kind of interesting as well. I'm not sure how good it's going to be just yet, but Cynthia, like I said, is going to be the main one that I really think will make its way into most decks in the format, which we desperately need, especially since right now there doesn't look to be a great replacement for Sycamore and N next season once they get rotated out of the format. And of course, we also have a new mechanic with the new Prism Star card. It's always exciting to see new mechanics get introduced into the game to keep things fresh. But then there's still a few things I am not that excited about. Honestly, I think the Pokemon in the set are great, and I thought this was on its way to being maybe the best Sun and Moon set yet, but I think the bad item cards in the set really hold it back from doing so. When you look at Guardians Rising, which had things like Aqua Patch, Choice Band, Field Blower, Rescue Stretcher, all of these huge cards that are in so many decks, and then you look at a set like this that gives us Pal Pad, which is maybe the best item in the set. I hate to say. It really falls a little bit short, but who knows? Maybe the set would have been too good if it had a host of broken item cards as well. And even though we did get the new Prism Star mechanic, I don't think many of them are initially very playable. I think the Solgaleo Prism Star is probably the best one, but a lot of the other ones I think are failing to find a home in a great deck initially, but I think all of them are still pretty solid as far as the Pokemon goes in particular. I think they all have solid effects and abilities and attacks, but like I said, Solgaleo is the main one that really looks to see play, I think, at the beginning of this new format. The boost energy is interesting, so is Cyrus, so I'm really enjoying this new mechanic, but like I said, I think only maybe Solgaleo and maybe the boost energy or Cyrus potentially have the most potential at the initial release of this set. And then we did not cover like the full arts and secret rares just because they're just reprints of cards that we already have. But if you look through them, there's not really many good secret rares. Of course, we got full arts for a lot of good things like Cynthia and all of the supporters. But as far as the secret rares go, the only good one we got was Crushing Hammer. The others are reprints of terrible cards. Like things like Peeping Red card and Missing Clover and stuff like that. So I suspect a lot of salty secret rare pulls from the set when people finally start opening their packs. But nevertheless, guys, this set is definitely one of the best we've had in a while. Crimson Invasion was so underwhelming. Shining Legends was a debatably more impactful set than Crimson Invasion. So it's great to see finally another great Sun and Moon set get released. I definitely think this set is going to be highly impactful for the game. So I'm giving it 4 out of 5 stars, and I figured, you know what, let's do a rating system for these sets. They are set reviews, but we always go through the cards, but we never give an actual rating for what we think about the actual set itself. So what do you guys think? Do you like having an actual rating for these sets? And the reviews definitely sound off below in the comment section too. So yeah, guys, that's going to be pretty much it for this one, though. As usual, feel free to like and subscribe, and if you're new to our channel, definitely stay tuned. We are going to have a ton of Ultra Prism coverage coming over the next couple weeks, so definitely stay tuned for our channel. And as usual, too, if you can support us over on patreon.com/rarecandytcg, big shout out to all of our patrons over there, or by picking something up from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would be greatly appreciated. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.